Inquisitor Alphon strode purposefully through the corridors of Cardinal Station, doing his best to ignore their unsettling nature. Though its walls had been covered by Imperial steel in most places, the original walls could still be seen in places, pale, curved, and entirely inhuman. Cardinal Station had been built by an unknown Xeno species millions of years ago, and had been discovered by Lord Inquisitor Elidios Ackerman years ago. The Radical had immediately seen the potential utility of such a hidden sanctuary, and had arranged for the station to be quietly upgraded and retrofitted for human uses. With the fall of Silberstadt and the terrible war that had engulfed the sector, Cardinal Station had become the center of operations for Imperial efforts throughout the Azeroth sector. It was big, almost 5 kilometers wide, and located in a star system accessible only if one knew the appropriate, singular warp route. How exactly Ackerman had discovered those in the first place was unknown, and given the situation, no one was willing to waste time finding out. A small flotilla was anchored in the station's orbit, made of the personal ships of the Inquisitors aboard and the few Imperial Navy vessels whose crews and officers were trusted enough to help guard this vital Imperial outpost. The ships turned around the station just as it turned around the system's star, a white dwarf without any natural satellites. Why the aliens who had built Cardinal Station had come here in the first place was but one of the many mysteries of the structure. In the last 10 months, Ackerman and Alphon had worked tirelessly to put the shattered Imperial armies back together, using astropaths and a network of courier ships to establish contact between the dispersed remnants of the Silberstadt Armada. The halls of Cardinal Station, once home only to working servitors, their overseers, and the ghosts of its builders, were now bustling with activity. 29 ships were anchored around the station, and more work was accomplished each week toward its rehabilitation than had been in the entirety of Ackerman's knowledge of its existence before the war. There were still sealed chambers that had yet to be explored, and agents of the Order Xenos had taken to the task with all the devotion that was to be expected of them. Useful as Cardinal Station was, no one wanted to risk there being something else aboard it with them. Alphon himself was on his way from one of the data centers, where cogitators brought in from all across the sector were made to work together by teams of tech priests who seemed positively shocked at the crude work they were forced to perform. But, crude or not, the union of the thinking engines with the data banks had been necessary. There was too much information that needed to be processed, with more brought in every day as reports arrived from the front. There was still far too much the Imperium did not understand about the vile foe they faced, and the data slate in Alphon's hands contained one more piece of that puzzle, one that the survivors of the massacre of Kemiro's Inquisitorial Fortress had wondered about for nearly 2 years. A small thing perhaps, when weighted against the desolation unleashed, but in Alphon's inquisitorial career, he had learned that the key to success was often found in the smallest, easily ignored details. Such was the size of Cardinal Station that it took him half an hour to reach his destination on foot, and then he had to wait another 5 minutes as security scanned him and checked that he really was who he appeared to be. After the treachery of Inquisitor Gales and Admiral von Krugerich, as well as the rebellions and cult uprisings taking place all over the sector, the Imperium wasn't taking any chances, even here at the heart of its operations. Though Alphon wasn't sure if these precautions were useful for much beyond reassuring everyone. If such august personages could be turned to the enemy's cause without anyone noticing it until it were too late, then there was little normal scans could do. Which was why there was a bound psyker next to the door passively scanning his surface thoughts, of course, but even then, there had been many psykers among the conclave, some of them incredibly powerful, yet none had caught on Gales' treachery until it was too late. In the center of the war room hovered a 3-dimensional hololith projection of the Azeroth sector. All around it were rows upon rows of console, arranged in concentric circles, behind which slaved dozens of tech adepts and data savants, with a flurry of aides moving in between them, carrying data slates as well as refreshments for the less augmented members of the intelligence group. Many had been acolytes before, working as analysts for their inquisitorial masters before they had been drafted into a more open kind of war against the enemies of mankind. Here, the leaders of the Imperial war efforts received reports from all across the sector, compiled the information, and made decisions that would shape the fates of billions. Representatives from all branches of the Imperial military were also present, though none of them were of an important rank. These individuals were all busy fighting their own part of the greater war, communicating with Cardinal Station through encoded messages and the very rare hololithic transmission, when the station psychers were able to maintain contact for long enough. The one exception was Captain Tyrion, of the heirs of Sanguinius. The Space Marine had narrowly avoided death at Silberstadt, but his body had been ruined beyond repair by the wounds he had taken fighting the Forsaken Sons. It would take months to grow all the replacement organs he needed, and in the meantime, the cumbersome cybernetics attached to his armor made him unable to fight. His mind was still as sharp as ever, though, and so he had been sent to Cardinal Station, to serve as his chapter's voice. The heirs of Sanguinius had been scattered across Azeroth along with the rest of the Imperial Armada, with individual companies fighting everywhere they could against the Black Crusade. Their positions were shown on the map by a simplified version of their emblem, a tear in a circle. As ever, Alphon absent-mindedly thought that the symbol mirrored the chained demon head used to represent the known Forsaken Sons Chaos Marines forces nicely. Half the worlds of the sector were aflame with rebellions and cults uprising, a situation not helped by the abrupt stop of the flow of resources from the Abyssian marches that had followed the fall of Silberstadt. Famine had spread, and with it disorder. Most of these uprisings weren't in any position of actually overthrowing imperial authority, but they kept the military forces of these worlds occupied, unable to provide help where it was desperately needed. These worlds showed in orange on the hololith, but it was the red dots that were truly concerning. Those were the worlds where one of the Forsaken Sons' splintered armada had arrived. The mighty host that had broken the Imperium's backbone at Silberstadt had split into several smaller warbands, though Alphon knew better than to hope this was because the enemy leader had lost control of his forces. No, this had all the hallmarks of a well-planned campaign. In some cases, like on Meridia, the hand of the Forsaken Sons in the rebellions was more overt. The Hive world's mutant population had risen again, once more led by a twisted lord whose inhuman charisma had united the freaks despite the purge they had so recently endured. At the same time, a fleet of ramshackle transports had arrived in the system, and unleashed another swarm of mutants onto the planet, led by a dreadful court of the huge abominations that seemed able to remove all fear of death in their followers. The manufactorums had ground to a halt as war had spread across the entire planet, with the Arbits and the PDF barely holding their ground against the teeming, fanatical hordes. On the Forge world's Etherian Alpha, the missing fabricator Kierol Mesa had returned to the abandoned city of Zetherian 9-6. Or at least, they thought the thing that had emerged from the warp portal that had suddenly torn open in the ruins of the lost city had been the fabricator. Within a few hours of its arrival, the forces left to guard the city had been butchered, and a host of abominable half-machine, half-demon constructs had started to flow from the breach in reality. Now, the entire planet was at war, with the other Forge cities fighting with all they had just to contain the corruption to the hellscape Zetherian 9-6 had become. The battle had spread to the entire Zetherian system, as a fleet of Dark Mechanicum warships laid siege to all of the Martian installations in their dominion. Zetherian and the neighboring systems had been turned into a battlefield where machine fought tainted machine, with no place for the weak flesh to interfere. The Mechanicus would not take part in the rest of the war until they had cleaned their own house, and all forces sworn to the Red Planet in the sector had flocked to that theater of war, abandoning all their allies in their haste to answer their overlord's call for help. As had always been the case, the sons and daughters of Mars would first look to their own. The Hive world of Achilles had become the playground of monsters. The lords of House Deland, it turned out, hadn't been the only ones to have been tempted into casting off their humanity in pursuit of power. The more Alphon learned about what was happening on the planet, the more certain he became that the late Inquisitor Gregory Irwin had been allowed to discover about the Deland's treachery partly to hide the true extent of the corruption. A dozen noble families and even more gangs had suddenly revealed that they had been led by inhuman monsters for Emperor knew how long, and their terrified underlings had been forced into helping them seize control of the world. Planetary order had collapsed, and the only reason the planet wasn't marked as lost on the hololithic display was that the various breeds of monsters had turned against each other as soon as they had destroyed the main Imperial forces. Now Achilles was a world torn apart by guerrillas, with the citizens cowering from the monsters in their midst or mounting desperate resistance cells, seeking safety in numbers. The Forsaken Sons' presence in the system was limited to a single ship, the Truthful Gate, which sat in orbit above the planet, safe from the planet's defenses thanks to the utter chaos that had spread below. From there, the being known in fearful whispers as the Unfettered took the people abducted from the surface by his servants and transformed them into more unholy monsters, before unleashing them back onto Achilles to observe the results of his work. So far, all attempts at infiltrating the Truthful Gate had failed. On Andros Rest, The angel with broken wings Inquisitor Matthias Alaric had heard of in the dying gasp of a blood-crazed guardsman had arrived. It had come in the jungles in fire and fury, as the savage tribes of that war-torn world had been driven to new peaks of violence by its presence. From the terrified, babbling testimonies of the few survivors, Ackerman had recognized it as a possessed marine of immense power, that the heirs of Sanguinius had encountered during their ill-fated boarding of the Hand of Ruin. How it had arrived to the planet was unclear. Neither the ships in orbit nor the system's space stations had detected any new arrival, though every astropath had sensed its coming. The Space Marines had 2 whole companies on the planet, helping the Imperial Guard forces hold back the maddened tribes while kill teams hunted the infernal abomination. Only the Astartes could hope to match the creature's unholy strength, or resist its corrupting influence. 6 systems were linked by a crimson line in the hololith, marking the stars lost to the advance of the unbound host. This splinter of the Black Crusade had driven deep within Azeroth, leaving nothing but dead worlds in its wake until they had reached the other border of the sector. They had used appalling weapons in each system on their path, not interested in conquest, only in not leaving any enemy alive behind them. Then, hundreds of Chaos Marines and millions of ruin-touched soldiers had seized the Beranos system, which stood between the Azeroth and Econta sectors. Beranos was a fortress now, inhabited by all manners of horrors and commanded by a Chaos Marine who called himself Malone, the Unbound Lord. And as long as Beranos held, then all the forces that were gathered from the Econta sector could not reach Azeroth, cutting off one of the Imperium's main avenues of reinforcement. They had finally learned what had happened to the shrine world Nereus Sanctus, where the traitor Gales Servantus had told the Watchers that the Cardinal had been driven to suicide. An astropathic message, sent by the last survivor of Gales' team but delayed in the warp by the same sorcery that had prevented Psychers across the sector from sensing what had occurred on the planet, had arrived a few weeks earlier. In it, the dying acolyte had described the horrors they had found on Nereus Sanctus, from their arrival into the system to the demonic incursion when Gales had called for the Cardinal to face him in the planet's main cathedral. The acolyte had thought his master dead, but Alphon and Ackerman knew the truth. Gales had been captured, and turned to the enemy. Knowledge that their peer hadn't broken his oath to the golden throne of his own free will had done little to assuage their fury. However, Gales would still need to be executed. As for Nereus Sanctus, it had become a den of demons and heretics, its population sacrificed to the dark gods or enslaved to topple the monuments to the god emperor and raise new ones dedicated to chaos. The acolyte's report mentioned that a dark apostle led the enslaved masses into their dark worship. But with the warp around the world seething, it was impossible to send help, or rather, considering how lost the planet must be by now, and exterminate his fleet. Chemairos, capital of the Azeroth sector, should by right have been the heart of Imperial command. The Hive world was well defended, and far away from the Abyssian marches that it should have taken years for the Black Crusade to reach it. Unfortunately, as the frigate Judgment's Will had left Silberstadt, its astropaths had received a dire warning. The inquisitorial headquarters on Chemairos had fallen, the tower reduced to rubble and all contact lost with the facilities below. After the disaster at the Conclave, there had only been a minimal presence left there, but the loss of even one Inquisitor wasn't something they could afford right now. Worst, the tower's underground had been where the Ordosh had stored some of the prizes from centuries of keeping Azeroth safe. Not all of them, of course. The Inquisition had a dozen vaults scattered across the sector. But when Alphon thought of the things that were now in the hands of whatever dark force had claimed the stronghold, the one good news from Chemairos was that the Lord's sector was proving far more competent in war than he had been in peace. Helions von Lexdark was single-handedly keeping the system from falling into anarchy as cults rose in every city and abominable things crawled out of the tower's ruins. According to the reports, no one was more surprised by the fat man's sudden courage and competence than the Lord Sector himself, who had risen to his position through intrigue, bribery and intimidation. He was accompanied by inquisitorial guards everywhere he went, just in case, and a group had been sent to discover what had happened in the old headquarters. Some of the files in the archives they had salvaged before the destruction had raised very disturbing implications, which was why they were using Cardinal Station now. And yet, for all the devastation, no one had seen the flagship of the Black Crusade, the infamous Hand of Ruin. The ship of Archon the Awakened One had vanished after the Battle of Silberstadt, and hadn't been sighted since. Whatever the Chaos Lord was up to couldn't be good, yet for all their efforts, they had yet to find a clue as to what his next move would be. Ackerman was convinced there was a greater pattern to Arkan's actions, some vital piece of the puzzle they were all missing. And he might very well be right, but the rest of the war still needed to be fought, even if it was only a giant, blood-soaked distraction. As Alphon crossed the threshold of the war room, he was met by cold, suspicious gazes. Despite his close ties with the Lord Inquisitor, he had been the one to insist Elydios claim the title in the aftermath of the disaster at Chemairos. After all, there were many who were distrustful of Alphon. Even among the Inquisitors, he had always been a lonely figure, belonging to neither one of the main Ordos nor claiming allegiance to one of the minor branches of the Inquisition. Inquisitors lived to uncover mysteries, but none of them had been able to find out anything suspicious about Alphon. His exemplar service to the late Lord Inquisitor Noriof Eldenswen had shielded him from more thorough investigations, which, of course, had only made him more suspicious in their eyes, and that suspicion had been passed on to their servants. As for the military personnel, well, anyone whom the Inquisition looked upon in that manner was clearly someone to be wary of. Alphon didn't blame them. He would have been offended if they had not been suspicious, and worried that they were slipping. The survivors of the carnage had accepted his push to make Ackerman Lord Inquisitor, because he had been the one to save them from the sorcerer, but once tempers had cooled, institutionalized paranoia had returned. The only two people who seemed pleased to see him were Elydios himself, sitting tall and commanding on his throne above the slowly rotating map, and Inquisitor Sylviana, in her new, rebuilt mechanical form. Her previous shell had been all but destroyed in the attack on the Conclave, and though her new one was still disturbingly human in shape, down to a face of flowing metal capable of duplicating emotions with unerring accuracy, Alphon knew that the tech priests had built in a number of powerful weapons. He had read the medical reports, only her brain was left, preserved by the safeguards of her rolled body. The other organs had been lost, and cloning new ones would have taken too long. Their mechanical replacements were a bit bigger, resulting in a new body that towered more than 2 meters high in order to fit them all in under the thick armor plating that covered her body. Even her face was just a mask on a hard shell, and her brain was held secure within her chest, behind enough protection to withstand a nuclear blast at point-blank range. Sylviana was determined that, when she next faced the scions of the arch-enemy, she would not be disposed of so easily again. Alphon could empathize. He too had taken to carry a few more weapons than he used to, including one he would not have admitted to owning under torture. Alphon walked directly toward them, and the circle of aides parted to let him pass. "We found something," he whispered, handing the data slate to Elydios. The Lord Inquisitor took it and began to read, his eyes moving down the text faster than any unaugmented mind could thanks to a discreet cerebral implant, and his face turned into a scowl as he read. Alphon already knew the contents of the data slate, of course. It was the result of months' worth of research in the archives, trying to find anything related to the Xenos creature that had decimated the Inquisitorial Conclave at the dawn of the Black Crusade. They hadn't had much, only its name, Carthago, the words it had burned into their minds before unleashing its terrible power, and those shouted by the population of the Agri-World poor maces, after they had been driven mad. But that had been enough, in the end, to find something. Carthago had been the name of a city of old Earth, in the antique times before mankind had first left its birth world. For a long time, it had been a rival of the ancient Romanii, until they had decided that they didn't want to share influence over the Mediterranean Sea with them anymore. Carthago had been burned, razed to the ground by Romanii legions, and the earth and ashes had been salted to ensure nothing would ever grow there again. "The sins of empires come back to punish those who committed them," the alien witch had said. There was more to the report. Before Carthago's destruction, one of the Romanii senators had grown obsessed with the rival city. His name was lost to history, but for years before the final destruction, he had ended every speech, no matter on which subject, with the words "Dialenda Carthago, Carthago must be destroyed." "Vengeance for Carthago," the madman of poor maces had shouted. "Dialendo Imperium." "So," said Ackerman once he had finished reading the report, "this Xenos which uses a name from mankind's distant past. We already suspected it was responsible for the events on poor maces, though how it drove the population mad is still unknown. Do you think it took the name itself, or was it given to it by the Forsaken Sons?" "The traitor who accompanied the alien at the Conclave was once of the 15th Legion," answered Alphon. "Our analysis of his armor is clear on that. And the sons of Magnus the Red, may he burn forever, were famous for their knowledge of ancient lore. A persona, forced upon it by the Forsaken Sons to help it control its powers? Thought Ackerman aloud. Or something else, something more sinister. Damn it, I wish we had the Sisters of Silence on our side. Any news on that front? Nothing, replied Sylviana, who was monitoring every incoming transmission at once through her inner cogitators. We have sent messages through the ancient protocols and contacted the rest of the Ordosh to do the same, but not a single response. It's as if they have all vanished since the War of the Beast. Tempting as it was to believe that there was a great hidden conspiracy responsible for the slow disappearance of the sisters, Alphon knew the explanation was far more mundane. The Sisterhood had been instrumental in defeating the Great Beast and saving the Imperium from the Orcs, but the accolades of history weren't for pariahs. Their mere presence made people uneasy, and slowly, imperceptibly, their support had dried up, until only their presence on the black ships remained, and only because no one else could possibly manage them. As for the Chamber's militant, continued Sylviana, we have received confirmation that they received our call for help, and that they are coming. The Death Watch operatives in the sector are leading operations against the enemy war machine where they can, but they are trained to fight aliens, not traitors. Last we heard, they were preparing to move to Meridia to hunt down the mutant warlords there. And the Grey Knights, well, I am not sure we would know even if they were already here. They fight the kind of things not even us should know exist. The Forsaken Sons are definitively in league with the ruinous powers, mused the Lord Inquisitor. And not just one of them, like most traitor warbands. Arkan was able to see me through time, and I sensed his power as I watched him through Lord Ragwell's eyes. He and the Hand of Ruin are still missing, along with a significant fraction of the ship seen emerging from the Wailing Storm at Silberstadt and the entire battle fleet of the traitor Krigrich. These forces could help break any of the ongoing battles, so they must be used for something. Once again, we go back to the question of what his overarching purpose might be. Everywhere the Forsaken Sons are involved seems to have some goal behind it, whether to cut us from reinforcements or to perform monstrous experiments on vast populations. So, surely, the missing forces must have their own objectives. But what is it? They were still pondering the question when the alarms started. A ship had been detected on the system's edge, appearing out of nowhere without any of the warning signs a conventional vessel would have caused. Warp technology, for all that the entire Imperium depended on it, was a clumsy and brutal thing, consisting of making the Materium and Immaterium meet by forcefully breaking through the barriers that existed between the two. There were more stealthy warp drives, the Inquisition often made use of them, but these were generally coupled with other stealth systems. The newcomer wasn't, or at least if it was, it hadn't turned them on. "It's an Eldar vessel, my lords," said the Auspex officer after a few moments of shouting had been calmed down by Tyrion loudly clearing his throat. For all that the captain was crippled, he was still taller than anyone else in the room and looked more than able to rip into anyone he thought had failed in his duties. "They are holding position at the system's Mandeville point." "Bring up the Auspex of the vessel," ordered Ackerman, rotating his chair to face the giant screen covering the wall behind him. The image that appeared was as clear as Cardinal Station's sensors could make it, and all three Inquisitors recognized the pattern, if not the exact ship. This was indeed an Eldar vessel, thinner and more elegant than any Imperial ship of the same tonnage could ever hope to be. It was the length of a frigate, with few visible weapons, and its colors were not those of any craft world Alphon could remember. "We are being hailed, my lords," called the Auspex officer. "On screen," replied Ackerman. There was a moment of static as the Imperial Vox receivers locked onto the frequency used by the Xenos, but when the image appeared it was unnaturally clear. There were two figures on the screen, standing tall and proud against a backdrop of bone-white wall. One was unmistakably Eldar, clad in the elaborate robes and armor of one of their Farseer. Judging by the curves of the armor, Alphon thought it was a female, but he wasn't sure. He was much more interested in the second figure. After all, it wasn't every day that you saw a human stand side by side with an Eldar. The man was tall, and wearing white and featureless clothes that had been cut with inhuman precision around his frame. A mane of silver hair fell onto his shoulders, and though his face was shaved and clean there was no hiding the gleam in his eyes, like that of a prophet come down from the mountain to bring terrible, unwelcome truths. The right sleeve of his garment had been removed, exposing the limb's pale skin, and the 6 glowing jewels embedded in the flesh, linked to each other by black, shining paths of foreign material. Alphon recognized the nature of the jewels, soulstones, and judging by their glow, occupied soulstones, with the spirit of a dead Eldar bound within them to avoid the horrible fate that awaited in the walk. "I am Farseer Elithri Eminius of Craftworld Mayan Tor," said the armored alien. "I come in peace, to discuss the threat to both of our people that has come into this region of space." "I am Tarek of Paraxis," said the man, and Alphon could hear a few muffled gasps at the mention of one of the worlds lost to the wailing storm centuries ago. Information on the lost Trebedius sector had been suppressed for a very long time, but with the coming of the Black Crusade most of the station's intelligence crew had received higher clearances. "I fought against the Forsaken Sons at the side of the Sons of Calth, and I come to help you defeat them where we failed, before the dreadful ambitions of the Awakened One come to fruition." "I am Lord Inquisitor Ackerman," said Elidios, his voice firm and stern. "How did you learn of this station's existence and location?" "With great difficulty. You have warded your lair well, servant of the Emperor. We had to walk the web of fate, to follow the threads leading from the broken fortress to here." "You have been to Silberstadt?" "When?" "Not too long ago." "We must speak face to face, servant of the Emperor. There are things we know that you must be told if there is to be any hope of stopping the one known as Arkan before his madness dooms us all." There was a tense silence as Ackerman silently considered his options. Alphon knew what he was going to say, though, the prospect of some answers was far too tempting to refuse. "Very well," said the Lord Inquisitor after a few seconds. "You can come aboard Cardinal Station. We will guide your transport to one of our flight decks. Only you two will be allowed in, though. Any more of your kind will be put down immediately, as will the both of you if either breaks faith with us. The Azarok sector has suffered too much from Xenos and traitors for us to take any chances." "As you wish," replied the Farseer. Tara didn't seem to mind either. His face had kept the same expression during the entire conversation, his eyes passing on everyone visible on his end of the transmission. There was an intensity in his gaze, as if he were more than just human, and considering the things embedded in his arm, perhaps he was. Certainly that would explain why the Eldar, a species famous for their arrogance, tolerated his presence at their side. The transmission shut down, and an uncomfortable silence descended on the command center as the crew turned to look at one another, wondering what it all meant. Alphon barked a short command, and the work resumed while he, Ackerman, Sylviana and Captain Tyrion left the room, a quick word from the Lord Inquisitor stopping the rest of the Imperial representatives from following them. Technically, Tyrion shouldn't have come with them either, but no one was going to say no to a space marine, even wounded as Tyrion was. Besides, if this Tarek had truly fought alongside the long-lost chapter of the Sons of Calth, then Tyrion deserved to hear about it firsthand. As promised, a single gunship left the Eldar vessel, which stayed at the edge of the system while the craft crossed the vast distance between the Mandeville Point and Cardinal Station. It landed under heavy guard, with inquisitorial stormtroopers surrounding it, weapons at the ready. In an adjacent room, a group of psychers were linking their minds, watching the two guests for the slightest hint of chaos corruption. They reported through their lord's earpieces that they couldn't sense any in the Farseer, but that the silver-haired man's soul and mind were so incomprehensible they couldn't get anything from them apart from a distinct sense of otherworldly power. The Farseer and the human descended from the craft and were quickly brought into a chamber set aside for private discussions. The six of them sat around a rectangular table of black marble, a priceless artifact from a world that had been destroyed during the Horus Heresy, and that Ackerman had claimed from the villa of a heretic noble years ago. The four representatives of the Imperium occupied one side of the table, while the Farseer and the silver-haired man sat on the opposite side. "All right," said Alphon, breaking the tense silence. "We are as isolated as we can be. Now, you have introduced yourselves already, so I think it's only polite we return the favor." The Inquisitor did a quick round of introductions, though he had a feeling both guests already knew who they all were. Elders had a reputation for knowing that sort of thing, and whatever Tarek had become, Alphon had little doubt he had more in common with the Xenos than with his own species now. After a while, since none of the others were saying anything, he sighed and continued. "So, you told us you came from Craftworld, Mayan Tor, correct? Which, by the way, I don't think any of us have ever heard of, which is ever so slightly annoying as Inquisitors and Space Marine. Why come out of hiding now, after Emperor knows how long successfully staying out of sight?" "Because the time has come," replied the Farseer. Hiding will no longer protect us from the galaxy. What the Forsaken Sons will unleash will find us no matter where we run." That got a reaction out of Ackerman, though Alphon doubted anyone as familiar as he had become with the Lord Inquisitor would have noticed. "You know what they are after," said Ackerman, rather than ask. "You know what their main objective is, the one for which all the other horrors are but mere distractions?" "We do," said Tarek. He was eerily calm, despite being in the presence of 3 Inquisitors, one of which had a body of metal, and a space marine. "Tell us, then," pressed Ackerman. "We have searched for months, and we have found nothing." And so they did. Alphon doubted that they told them everything, but they told them enough. Tarek told them of Paraxis, his homeworld, how he, a simple sea captain, had ended up fighting alongside every able-bodied man and woman of that world against the Forsaken Sons. He spoke of the nightmares the traitor Marines had unleashed, of the sacrifices the Imperials had made and the damage they had inflicted upon their hated foe, but it had not been enough. His voice remained steady as he spoke of horrors no man could hope to face and retain his sanity. He told them of the Shi'alat, these degenerate Eldar who had sold their souls to chaos with wild abandon, and been brought back from rightful extinction by the Forsaken Sons' flesh-smiths. The Farseer intervened there, telling the old story of her people about the exiles of the Eldar Empire, who had been cast out because their corruption was too great even for the decaying morals of their stellar dominion. And finally, Tarek told of the crown of Eldar soulstones he had torn from the skull of a witch in the final hours of the war for Paraxis. He told them of the inhuman killer sent after him, and how the spirits in the stones had saved him by casting him into the warp, where he had wandered, protected by their power, until he had reached the craft world, alive, but changed. "So," said Tyrion when the tale was over, "the Sons of Kalth are truly dead." "They are," replied Tarek in a solemn tone. "They died as heroes, each and every one of them. I fought by their side in the city of Talixorn against the hordes of the undead, and again in Asthena as we made our final stand against the forces of chaos. And never once did any of them recoil from the danger, even when none of us could see any hope in the darkness. We must inform the Ultramarines. The fate of the Sons of Kalth has haunted the Scions of Guilliman for centuries. They will be relieved to know their brothers died with honor." "And we will, Captain. But we must first deal with the current threat we face. An astropathic sending to Ultramar could be intercepted by our enemies, revealing that we know more than they intended us to." Elithria took over then. She spoke of the disastrous attempt of the Farseers to scry the intent of the Awakened One, and the terrible cost it had exacted. Much of what the Xenos witches had learned in their final moments was nonsense, but Elithria had been able to interpret enough of their rambles to identify the true goal of the Forsaken Sons. Riaway Noera. Nightmare Fleet. The word sent a shiver down Alphon's spine. A fleet of sentient ships, possessed by Neverborn. Truly the fleet deserved its name, because it was the combination of the 2 darkest nightmares of mankind. Abominable intelligences and demons, forged together during the time of humanity's greatest technological accomplishments and lowest morality. Even the horrors of the heresy paled in some respects compared to what had been wrought during the dark age of technology, when science had been unbound by the Emperor's holy decrees and techno-lords had sought transcendence at any cost, uncaring of the monsters left in their wake. Already Azeroth burned, but if the Nightmare Fleet was released from its ancient prison, the entire Segmentum, possibly the entire Imperium, would be at risk. And that was without taking into account the other fleet imprisoned within the Eldar's ancient prison, even if no one at the table was talking about it aloud. The idea of an entire battle fleet from the glory days of the Eldar Empire being suddenly returned into the modern era was disquieting, to say the least. The Imperium had only legends of what the Eldar had been capable of in those long-lost days, but even accounting for the inevitable hyperbole, the Xenos had been far beyond even the peak of the Dark Age of technology in terms of science, dominion, and psychic power. Though how these ancient warriors would react to a galaxy where their race's souls belonged to the Dark Prince, yes, came a voice directly into Alphon's head. It would be better for everyone if we never found out. The Inquisitor's eyes widened. The voice hadn't been that of the Farseer, it had been male, and human. His gaze fixed onto Tarek, who was smiling ever so slightly while Elithria continued her explanation of how she and the silver-haired man had gone to Silberstadt and traced the Lord Inquisitor's path to Cardinal Station. "You read my mind?" asked Alphon, unable to keep the alarm from his thoughts. There were so many secrets in his head, so many things he had sworn to take to his grave, but no psyker should have been able to get past through his mental blocks, no matter how Xenos touched. "No," replied Tarek in the same silent voice. "Only your surface thoughts, which echo in the Empyrean around us. Elethria can't even do that. Your blocks are quite remarkable. But I have a human's sensibilities and the psychic powers of several Eldar. I am capable of things neither could do on their own. I can also sense your disgust, Inquisitor. Yes, I know I am an abomination, a thing half man, half alien, anathema in the eyes of the master of mankind. But even if your mind is closed to me, there is still one secret of yours that I can tell. We are not as different as you would like." "I am nothing like you," sent back Alphon, almost savagely. Tarek sent back the mental equivalent of a shrug. "As you wish. I will keep your secret. But the time for any of us to hide our true capabilities draws to a close. Soon you will have no choice but to reveal it yourself." There was something unsettlingly prophetic in Tarek's sending, and Alphon tore his gaze from the man's silver eyes, forcefully ending the connection. He had many secrets, as did every Inquisitor, and he was damned if he would let the words of whatever Tarek had become dictate his course of action. He would do what he had always done, what his duty to the Imperium demanded. The others were still talking, none of them having noticed Alphon's discomfort. "We both want to stop the servants of the great enemy," Elethria was saying. "You do not know where the Riaway Nora can be found, and we do not have the strength to defend it on our own. An alliance between our people against this common foe is not just logical, it is necessary. Your kind has proven, time and again, that it cannot be trusted," grunted Tyrion. "How many times have you used this knowledge of the future to manipulate Imperial forces into doing your dirty work for you, only to abandon them once you didn't need them any longer? Oh, I do not doubt you want the Forsaken Sons stopped, they are as much a threat to you as to us. But what proof do I have that this nightmare fleet is even real, and not a fanciful story you invented to make us send our fleets where you want them?" "I was there when the Farseers of Myantor peered into the paths of fate," said Tarek, and the glow of his eyes and the jewels in his arm diminished as he spoke, making him seem much more human all of a sudden. "I saw them die, struck down by the power of chaos, and listened to their dying words. I saw the records of the Nightmare Fleet in the Craft World's archives. You have my word, Captain, that Lady Elethria speaks truly. I swear it upon the memory of my comrades who fell against the Forsaken Sun." There was a moment of silence as Tyrion stared into Tarek's eyes, both entirely unfazed by the inhuman nature of the one they faced. Ackerman stepped in. "We know there is another objective to this Black Crusade, Captain. The Nightmare Fleet is a perfect explanation, though I am still at a loss as to why Arkan wants to unleash it. Is he insane enough to think he can actually control it?" "Arkan's madness is a cold one," said Tarek, finally breaking his tense glaring contest with the air of sanguinius to look at the Lord Inquisitor. "On Paraxis, his strategies were vicious and cruel, but effective. He wields the other slaves of ruin like instruments to his own ends with great skill. If he seeks the Nightmare Fleet, then he definitely has a plan to deal with it once he breaks its prison." "He must have learned about it from these Shailat creatures you described," mused Sylviana. "But would they know where the dimensional prison can be accessed?" "We do not know," admitted Elethria. "Our own knowledge of these events is limited. The location of the final battle between the Empire's fleet and the Riaway Nora was removed even from Myantor's archives, to prevent any future fool from trying to free our imprisoned heroes. But we do know where that knowledge can be found, and it is a place the Shailat would know of as well. Myantor is already on its way there, and if you agree to an alliance, then I shall guide you there as well, that we may stand together against the forces the Forsaken Sons are sure to send. Even if Arkan already knows the location of the Riaway Nora, he will send his fleet there to make sure we don't gain access to that information." "I see," said Ackerman. "And of course you won't share that information with us unless we do agree to your offer of alliance, Captain Tyrion. I share your reticence, but we have no choice. This is our only lead on where Arkan may be going, and the mere possibility of the Nightmare Fleet being real is too terrible for us to take any chances." "I understand," replied the heir of Sanguinius, nodding curtly. "As Lord Inquisitor of Azeroth and leader of its Imperial forces, I agree to your offer, Farseer Elethria. We shall be allies until the Black Crusade has been defeated. Is that acceptable?" "It is," agreed the Eldar, with Tarek smiling slightly at her side. "If you could bring us to a star map, I will show you where we must go. If you agree to it, we will use the webway to reach our destination. Even though that will require several jumps, it will still be faster than your own method of galactic travel, especially with the Sea of Souls as turbulent as it is now." "Very well," said the Lord Inquisitor, rising from his seat. "Follow me. I will bring you to our command center, though I am sure you understand, my people will hide any confidential information not directly related to the Black Crusade before we get there." "Of course they will," murmured Tarek as he too stood up. Several minutes later, the group of Imperial and Eldar representatives were in the command center, quickly emptied for the occasion and with every terminal shut down. The cogitator running the map had been programmed by a very remorseful tech priest so that it wouldn't remember anything that was happening to it. It had taken the threat of bodily harm to convince the cogboy to even perform the Oblivion ritual, and he was going to spend weeks in penance for it. Alphon was at the controls, moving the view at the directions of Elithria, who was staring at the floating map, converting Eldar navigation charts into the, no doubt vastly inferior in her mind, Imperial standard. Eventually, she indicated a single system, isolated far from the main warp routes of the Azeroth sector, deep within what was unofficially known as the Graveyard, a region of Azeroth that had been entirely devastated during the War of the Beast. "Here," she said. "This is where the Archive of Loss lies." There was a pause as the Imperials in the room glanced at each other, recognition flashing in their eyes. Then Alphon brought up the system's data, displayed in glowing red letters next to the star. Plus Imperial Record 556C38 FGZ3A6 plus System Neril plus World, Neril Prime, Cemetery World plus Population, 12,025, Caretakers and Support Staff plus Notable Assets, none plus Activity Center, Cathedral of St. plus a Cemetery World, murmured Tarek. "Of course it would be on a Cemetery World. Where else?" "I do not know what that means," admitted Elithria. "What have your people done to that world?" "It is sacred ground," explained Elidios. "Where the dead of the war against the orcs from all across this region of Azeroth were buried centuries ago. Billions of people were laid to rest on Neril Prime, and the planet is a monument to the losses of the War of the Beast. The entire planet is covered in tombstones." "The Archive of Loss was buried deep beneath the planet's surface," said the Farseer, "and protected from detection by the best technology of the Empire. It makes sense your own systems wouldn't have found it. But, we will likely need to dislodge some of the tombs to access it." There was something in Elithria's voice that, in a human, might have been regret, but Alphon didn't believe it. What did this Xenos which care for the remains of the Imperium's honored dead? Tarek was parading the very souls of her own kind on his arm, and she was apparently fine with it. "So be it," declared Ackerman. "We cannot let our concern for the dead outweigh the importance of the living. It will take some time for us to be ready to follow you, however." "Then we will return aboard our ship," said Elithria, "and await your signal. But make haste, servant of the Emperor. Our time is running short." "Elidios," murmured Alphon several moments later, once the Farseer and Tarek were back aboard their transport and had left the station. "If the Forsaken Sun's missing forces really are at Neril, then we don't have the numbers to face them there. We can't count on the Eldar to do all the work for us, and our own forces are stretched thin across the entire sector. Disengaging any of them will cost us billions of lives." "I know," replied the Lord Inquisitor. "But this is an information-gathering mission. We don't need to defeat the Forsaken Sons at Neril, only hold them back long enough to get what we need from the Archive and leave. Hopefully by then the blockade at Beranos will have been breached and we will have more troops to join us on the journey toward the Nightmare Fleet's location." "And if it isn't?" pressed Alphon. "If the blockade holds? Then we will pay the price in worlds if needs be," said Elidios, his expression grim. "But we cannot let the Forsaken Sons unleash this evil upon the galaxy, even if the entire sector must burn." There was nothing Alphon could say in response. Necessity, as always, was a most cruel mistress, and for all their power and authority, the lords of the Ordosh were still her slaves. 7 we were, 1 we are. They spoke of this, the seers who died when they saw the smoke of the burning tombs, of the hand of death and the hand of sin fighting among the ruins of the past. This can mean only one thing. They know, the Sons of Ruin. They know of this place, and they will come to stop us. Destiny comes. The hunter comes. Doom is coming for us once more. 7 we were, 1 we are. But for how much longer? O Emperor, let it end soon. Hours later, Elidios was alone in his chambers. His quarters were bare of all luxuries, with nothing but a bed, a desk, and the single metal chair on which he sat, his head resting on his crossed arms. He was thinking back on the day's events, and whether the alliance with the Eldar was a mistake. Seemingly, the Xenos were the answer to his prayers. They had told him the true purpose of the Black Crusade, and a way to fight against it. And yet he couldn't help but doubt. If the Forsaken Sons knew about the Nightmare Fleet, then they must also know about Tor. Would they not have taken the Eldar into account in their plans then? Furthermore, though he did not believe Tarek had lied to them, he distrusted the man, if he could still be called that. Tarek's experiences had removed him from humanity, and it was the creed of the Inquisition that such beings could not be tolerated. Even a radical like Elidios, who believed that some of the tools forbidden to the common people of the Imperium could be used against its enemies, knew that there were very good reasons for this policy. He was still brooding over these matters when a transmission came in on his desk's receiver. The signal's frequency was only to be used for messages of extreme urgency, and he immediately pressed the appropriate rune on the device to open the channel. Yes? What is it? My Lord Inquisitor, came a breathless voice. We have received word from Beranos. The Imperial Relief Fleet has just arrived in the system and has engaged the Chaos forces there. And according to the Astropath's interpretation of the transmission, they are led by the Grey Knights. Achilles' fall to Chaos had been swift and traumatic, but the preparations for it had taken decades, and its root causes stretched back even longer. Ever since the Great Crusade, when it had been freed from the cruel rule of a bloodline of kings and queens that had descended into madness a dozen generations before their fall, the world had been ruled by a noble class. These worthies were descended from the officers of the Imperial Army who had brought Achilles to compliance, having then been granted the right to remain on the world and help ensure its integration into the greater Imperium. Such things had been common back then, a way to reward the hosts of the Imperial Army while helping ensure that newly conquered worlds would be kept peaceful. The families had always been proud of that heritage, and had endeavored to keep their bloodlines pure rather than mingle with the subjugated local population, as the rest of the occupying regiments had. They had lorded over their lesser, secure in the knowledge that they held the God Emperor's favor and blessing. They had been no worse rulers than those found in the rest of the Imperium. If truth be told, their very pride in the holiness of their office actually kept them a little less corrupt and cruel than most, though that was a very relative term. Under their leadership, Achilles had grown to become a prosperous hive world of the Azeroth sector. Then the Orcs had come. In the 32nd millennium, the great beast had risen, and the green tide had swept through the galaxy, leaving naught but desolation in its wake. The skies of Achilles had been filled with the baleful grin of an Orc attack moon. The impossibly massive weapon had torn through the planet's orbital defenses and the system's defense fleet, while the Xenos hunted human prey across the entire world. The noble family's vaunted lineage had done nothing to protect them, and the Orcs had broken into their spires and made sport of the house heads, torturing them and eating them alive over a period of days. Entire families had gone extinct, and the rest had been decimated. They would all have fallen, had the Orcs not been called away from Achilles by the promise of a greater battle, against a true foe, the Space Marine chapter whose surviving members would, in the aftermath of the war, become the core of the heirs of Sanguinius. The survivors had crawled out of hiding and given thanks to the God Emperor for their deliverance, but the hideous, shameful fear of those dark days had marked them deeply. Their houses had rebuilt, repopulated, and rewritten the past to maintain their hold on to Achilles' population, but they had never forgotten the truth. Never forgotten their weakness, or that the Emperor had done nothing to save their kindred from the Xenos invaders. For many years, they tried to salve their pride, collecting orc bones and other tokens in an attempt to exorcise their terror. In the aftermath of the War of the Beast, there were plenty of trophies to purchase, and the families had bankrolled expeditions into Greenskin territory to find more. Yet the survivors of the Purge had never taken part in these expeditions themselves, nor had they allowed any of their descendants to. They had remained in their rebuilt gilded spires, trying to drown their nightmares in extravagant luxury and decadent parties, surrounded by proofs of their terror's mortality. Years turned to decades, which turned to centuries, and still the fears of Achilles' house leaders would not go away. Noblemen still woke in the middle of the night shivering with dread. That was when the former apothecary of the 17th Legion, simply known as the Unfettered, had made his move. At the command of his Lord Archon, he had established contact with several houses. Using the network of agents the Lords of Ash and Shadows had seeded throughout Azeroth, he had exchanged letters with the house's leaders, posing as a fellow noble from another world that had also suffered from the Orcs' barbarity. He offered them strength, a way to no longer need to rely on the might of others to protect them, a way to become mightier than any Orc, any Xenos. The Unfettered was cautious, and used all the persuasiveness of his gene line, manipulating people he had never met into doing what he wanted. With the help of the Sorceress Coven, his words were laced with subliminal messages, while the very material of the letters contained subtle mind-altering substances. Soon, a conspiracy had formed, a cabal of nobles pursuing the power the Unfettered promised. A few basic rituals and alchemical formulas showed them the truth of their mysterious contact's offer, and by the time they learned of his true nature, they reveled in their power too much to care. They willfully threw away their humanity in the name of power, isolating and discreetly eliminating those among them who would not follow their leaders into damnation. All of them had been able to hide their true nature, for though they had already betrayed the Golden Throne, they were still unwilling to risk all that they had by openly defying the Imperium's rule. That changed when the Inquisition wiped out House Deland. The nobles did not know that Inquisitor Erwin's discovery had been orchestrated. All they saw was a bleak reminder of what would happen to them if the truth ever came to light. And so, when the call came, when the Forsaken Sons broke the might of the sector at Silberstadt and the Unfettered himself came to Achilles, they threw off their disguises and pretense of allegiance to terror. With the help of the gangs they had made into allies by sharing the Unfettered's gifts with their leaders, they overthrew the governor, slaughtered the Arbits and Administratum representatives, and murdered every priest of the Imperial Creed within their burning churches. Those families who hadn't been part of the conspiracy had been destroyed, their ancestral homes burned and despoiled amidst acts of cruelty that made the coming of the Orcs look downright pleasant. Within a few days of horror and death the likes of which hadn't been seen on Achilles since the War of the Beast, the entire planet had fallen, and the conspiracy had turned against itself soon after. Dominion over Achilles had been promised to the Inhuman houses, and the Unfettered had no interest in ruling the world anyway. With the Imperium's presence reduced to a handful of survivors hiding from their hunters, the monsters believed they had nothing left to fear, and were now battling for control of the world. Factions had formed, uneasy alliances binding noble lines, crime syndicates, and doomsday cults whose members hoped to prove their worth and undergo the same unholy transfiguration as their masters. Cities were in the grip of one of these groups or still contested, warbands battling in the streets while civilians covered in their homes. Some fought for power, for plunder, for position, others still because they had enjoyed the fighting, and sought to prove themselves worthy of joining the great army of the Forsaken Sons when they came. For the planet's industry still turned, albeit a lot more slowly, and was being repurposed to feed the Forsaken Sons' war machines. There weren't many markets still open to the world's new rulers, after all. The Truthful Gate, ship of the Unfettered, had brought machines that could turn living humans into cultures of biological slop that the masses could use as sustenance, a brown goo that tasted only slightly worse than their usual fare under Imperial rule. The mining operations across the rest of the system also continued, the miners overseen by new, inhuman masters. The fruit of their labor was brought to Achilles aboard enormous, bloated freighters that discharged their cargo and took great care to stay away from the Truthful Gate as it orbited the planet. For now, the production of the factories was being stockpiled, to be traded when the Forsaken Sons came looking for supplies. No one knew when that would happen. If the Unfettered and his small group of Chaos Marines knew, they weren't talking. And so life continued on Achilles, full of fear and intrigue. Months had passed since the coming of Chaos, and, in a dark testament to the resilience and adaptability of the human spirit, the people of Achilles were slowly growing used to their new situation. They had spent their entire lives under the thrall of the houses, whose members had been so distant and lives so different they might as well have belonged to another species already. Sure, now the nobles sometimes actually ate them alive, but day-to-day life wasn't so different, save for the destruction of every church of the Imperial Creed and the interdiction of worshipping the Emperor under pain of slow, agonizing death. The screams of the priests had been broadcast for several weeks after the uprising, which had been enough to douse the faith of most people. Those who still clung to the cult of the God Emperor did so in secret, Behind closed doors, every prayer whispered in fear that it would be their last. The new lords of Achilles, who had spent years hiding their new allegiances, found this reversal of fortune pleasing. Whenever such believers were unmasked, their fates were increasingly crueler than those of the last batch. After several months, the believers were becoming harder and harder to discover, but that didn't discourage some of the houses to continue their hunt. Even the damned needed hobbies, after all. And there were still some agents of the Inquisition hiding on the planet, sending their reports off-world through traumatized astropaths rescued from their towers in the final hours before the planet's downfall. They hid within the ruins and abandoned sections of the hives, and led small raids against the houses, but never achieved anything more than annoy them, and provide prey to distract them. The scions of the house pursued the remnants of the Ordos with even greater focus than the worshippers of the false emperor, driven by the memories of House Delan's fate. For, despite all the power they had gained, the nobles of Achilles were still ruled by their fears. In the place of the ecclesiarchy, all manners of chaos cults were flourishing, the seed of corruption taking root easily within the souls of a terrified and traumatized population. The same promises that had brought the houses to ruin now wormed their way into the hearts of their subjects. They too could be mighty, they too could be predators rather than prey, if they would but pay the price. Sinister congregations gathered in dark temples, offering vile prayers and bloody sacrifices to the ruinous powers, led on by wild-eyed demagogues and warp-crazed seers. With every passing day, the cults grew stronger, and Achilles' damnation became a little more complete. Without the light of faith and rigid, unquestioning obedience to the God Emperor to keep them at bay, flocks of demons pressed on the other side of the veil separating reality from the warp, whispering tempting lies and dark truths into the souls of those touched by the Empyrean. Many had already crossed over, possessing hosts offered to them by the cults, but none had been able to remain material for long. Whenever a cult successfully summoned their infernal patron, it was immediately crushed, its demonic master banished back into the pit or bound into service. This was the one command the unfettered had given to the houses, and they were more than happy to oblige him. Achilles was still firmly in the materium, and the houses weren't eager to share their new realm with the Neverborn. Having surpassed the limits of humanity and received what they thought was eternal life, their own belief in the ruinous powers was limited. They saw themselves as gods. Why should they worship anything else than the one who had brought them this power? And so, while the cult of chaos spread among the masses, the houses embraced a more esoteric faith, one based on power, immortality, and the enhancement of their transfigured forms. But the dark gods are jealous divines, and one among them is subtle beyond the ken of mortals. Ever since humanity had risen from old Earth, it had been haunted by the question of what happened after death. Did the mind vanish into oblivion after the body ceased to function, or was there something more waiting? For thousands of generations, priests, philosophers and conmen had invented various answers, coming up with extravagant afterlives that could only be reached by the truly faithful. But it had only been with the rise of the psyche and the discovery of the warp that the existence of the soul itself had been proven beyond question. Yet still there had been no definite answer, for no psyche could bear to look too long or too deeply into the Empyrean. Of course, that hadn't stopped many from pretending they could, or even from genuinely believing that whatever visions of madness they glimpsed were real. The Great Crusade had ruthlessly crushed the faiths that claimed there existed paradises within the warp, with the imperial truth proclaiming that death was the end of one's existence as a conscious entity, but that one's legacy could endure for all eternity. Now, with the ecclesiarchy firmly implanted within every level of the Imperium, mankind believed once more. In some aspects, the imperial creed was unlike any that had come before, while in others, it was painfully familiar. It was divine canon that the faithful dead were taken to the God Emperor's side, while traitors and heretics burned forever in the darkest pits of hell. The details of both fates varied depending on local customs, but the general narrative remained the same. It made a very useful tool to keep the toiling masses that made the Imperium possible in their place. Nothing made backbreaking labor bearable like the promise of paradise, and nothing kept the mind from wandering like the ironclad certainty that damnation lay that way. Such was the cold calculation made by the High Lords of Terror when they allowed the imperial creed to form, spitting on the ideals of the Great Crusade in the process. The devastation wrought by the Horus heresy, the turmoil left by the silence of the Emperor and the revelation of the warp's true nature, were too much of a threat to the continued survival of the human species to allow for any half measure. Order had to be maintained, lest it all be for nothing. But even the boldest and most shameless of lies could contain a grain of truth. And while those who served the dark gods scoffed at the idea of the corpse god granting his slaves eternal bliss, they knew all too well hell was real. They saw it every time they called forth the Neverborn, or peered into the sea of souls for knowledge. Among themselves, they passed tales of the grand rewards awaiting the servants of the ruinous powers, the eternal battlefields of Khorne, the pleasure palaces of Slunch, the Garden of Nurgle and the shining crystal labyrinth of Zionch, where all knowledge could be found. But those who were more than deluded worshippers knew the truth, in their heart of hearts, that only the claws of demonic predators awaited them, to tear their souls to shreds and feed on everything they were. The kindest fate then was dissolution, but some shred of identity would still endure, forever screaming in the Empyrean's timeless infinity. It was something they all feared, save for those so made they cared for nothing at all. No wonder, then, that so many of the lost and the damned's champions pursued immortality. But every rule had exceptions. The demon princes of the warp were the most well-known, and theirs was the destiny sought after by the champions of ruin, but there were others. Fear of death was a thing that transcended time and species alike, after all. Some souls were protected by pacts, or powerful enough to linger on after death, fighting off the warp predators drawn to the light of their unfettered spirits. Others, like the Dark Eldar, cheated death by keeping part of themselves separated from the main body through secret, dark arts, allowing them to regrow their body upon death with the soul still anchored to it. Their cousins in their craft worlds preserved the soul in gems, denying the ravenous hunger of she who thirst and existing beyond death within the infinity circuit. Though the Eldar had perfected these methods, under the fear of sludge that hung over their every moment, there were others who had replicated them over the millennia. Long-forgotten temples held the souls of Xeno's overlords who had every reason to fear the afterlife, and great vaults held the resting spirits of entire species whose witch priests had stumbled upon the secrets of denying the warp its tithe of souls. Of course, the dark gods were jealous divines, and often directed their followers to destroy such places, lest mortals start getting ideas above their station. And then, there was that rarest of creatures, a soul returned to the materium by the god it belonged to. Broken, twisted and reforged in the image of that god, but still a mortal soul, spared from devouring and burning because it was too useful, or too amusing. Yet at the same time not wholly replaced with infernal power, its free will completely erased as it became nothing more than an extension of the dark god's will bearing a mask forged of its hollowed identity. An instrument, or a toy, brought back to a semblance of life for some purpose, whether it knew it or not. The thing that had once been Alaric Heinrich, explorer of Drakencraft Castle for the Empire of Eldar, fell to the hive world Achilles like a dark comet. His god-forged spirit fell through the many layers of Hive Herringrad, its ghostly passage causing nightmares and fits of insanity among those near its trajectory. It tore through the pollution clouds that covered the city, triggering a rain of multicolored acid drops that burned the skin of those under it. Finally, it slammed into a pile of mutating matter at the bottom of the den of horrors that was Dartenbach Spire, discarded remnants of another mad experiment. The grotesque thing groaned and twisted in agony for several minutes before bursting apart in an explosion of gore, revealing the new, fully grown form of Alaric standing in the offal. A potent smell of ozone almost, but not quite, overpowered that of meat and bile. The shape of Alaric's new body was humanoid, but there the resemblance with his mortal one ended. It was a thing of blue fire and silver, a twisted parody of a knight of legend. Pieces of armor, a chestplate, shoulder pads, gauntlets and greaves, shaped from silver-tinted crystal, were anchored onto living flames and inscribed with the runes of Zionch that blazed with too bright light. Images could be glimpsed into the inferno, terrible vistas of infinite expanses that could shatter the mind that looked too deep. The fire burned brightest under the helmet that had replaced Alaric's face, a brutal, angular thing crested by a pair of curled horns. The reforged soul took in his surroundings, filled with all the squalor to be expected at the bottom levels of an imperial hive world, especially one fallen to the forces of chaos. He looked up to the spire, looking through the layers of metal and the clouds of pollution and seeing the broken, hollowed, haunted tower where an entire family and their servants had dwelled before being destroyed for their refusal to embrace the new order. He knew that the creature that had birthed his new form had been formed by the last surviving members of the Tartanbach bloodline, dragged out of their home by their enemies and turned into one more abomination as a final insult, while their home became a place for the worst predators of Achilles to gather. He also knew that this was one of two spires left empty by the wrath of their master's enemies. The other was the former domain of House de Land, brought low by the Inquisition when their treachery had been discovered. Spire de Land had been left as a monument of the Emperor's judgment upon those who had joined Chaos. It made perverse sense that the ruins of House Tartanbach, who had refused to join the conspiracy that had brought Achilles down, would be the vessel through which Alaric, bringer of another god's wrath, manifested on this world. Alaric left, walking with dread purpose, and the shadows gathered around him to drown his azure light into darkness. It would not do for the lords of Achilles to notice his presence yet. He had much to do before he could reveal himself to his prey, and powerful as he had become during his reforging in Xianx's fire, he was aware that not even he could stand against the full might of Achilles' houses. The exact reason of his presence on Achilles was still vague to him. His mind no longer worked in the patterns it used to, and the solidity of his surroundings after so long spent in the realm of change was throwing him off. But he remembered enough to know where he must go. "Begin recording for case study 352, said a cold, artificial voice. Subject appears to be suffering from a degenerative disease, leading to the atrophy of his entire muscular mass. Yet according to the operatives who brought the body, it displayed physical power far in excess of standard human parameters before it was brought down by a lucky hit at the back of the cranium. The scalpel cut through the corpse's pale skin, parting it to reveal the organs beneath. They were shriveled and sickly, and already starting to decay. Two more cutting tools descended, removing a fragment of skin and bringing it to a tube carried by another mechanical tendril. After a few seconds, a rune went green on a nearby console, and the voice resumed, which would indicate affiliation to the Kerner Greek strain. Samples show a higher than normal psychic imprinting, even 35.12 standard hours after death. Hypothesis: the corpse lords, as they are vulgarly called, draw their increased strength from specialized psychic abilities. Secondary hypothesis: over-reliance on this power leads to their body's degradation due to their muscles not performing necessary levels of activity to maintain themselves. Using the psychic ability may trigger the brain's reward center, or it may purely be a sociological factor. Using their powers in all circumstances would allow them to grow stronger, or just reinforce their doctrine of superiority over baseline humans. An interview with a living specimen will be required to clarify. The figure hunched over the emaciated body strapped on a dissection table bore no resemblance to the tech priest he had once been. Since the collapse of the Mechonicus hierarchy on Achilles, he had removed more and more of his flesh, bypassing the decades of training and service it would have taken him to qualify for such blessings under the old order. What remained of his body was encased within a reinforced box located somewhere under the dozens of mechadendrites and other appendages emanating from his center of mass, which was held up by 10 articulated legs. His voice came from 3 speakers at once, echoing in the chamber with disturbing overlaps. The speakers were located inside the mouths of 3 faces sculpted onto the core of the heretic's body, each a different grimace of pain, fury and hatred, the one concession to aesthetics in his entire form. Before Achilles' fall, the heretic had been called Ulcrian 95, and he had been counted among the lowest orders of the priesthood, thought likely by his superiors to remain there for the rest of his life. But these superiors were dead now, and he was known by a different name, first given to him in half-jest by one of his associates. A name that reflected how he had completely left the holy form of humanity behind in his quest for power and transcendence. He was the Spider, a lord in his own right within Achilles' new society. The warbands fighting for control of the hive city in which he dwelled went to him to trade, offering corpses or captives in exchange for augmetics and effective, if brutal and painful in the extreme, medical assistance. The body is still hot, current temperature of sample 40.5819 degrees according to the blessed scale of Celsius. Tertiary hypothesis: the energy acquired from the Empyrean continues being drawn even after brain death. Individual cells of the body capable of extracting power to continue activity after demise of the larger organism they are a part of? I must hurry to analyze the gene sequences of this subject. If the unfettered truly has come this far. The spider's musings were interrupted by a sudden alarm. Something had passed through the outer layer of the defenses surrounding his lair, taking down the corrupt servitors stationed there as if they were nothing. More alarms rose as new sections of his small domain were breached, and it was clear from the intruder's path that it was coming right toward the spider's laboratory. Surveillance systems told the spider that this was a single individual, though they couldn't get a proper fix on its nature. With a thought, the heretic called his minions, sending dozens of cybernetic killers to intercept the newcomer, with instructions to bring him the remains once they were done. With the not inconsiderable effort the spider had put into his protection, anyone able to pierce through the outer defenses had to be a member of the houses, perhaps even another Kerner Greek, come to avenge or recover the corpse of his fellow. It wouldn't be the first time something like that happened, and it wouldn't be the first time such an outraged noble ended up adding to the spider's trove of knowledge either. The spider wasn't opposed to returning the bodies to the houses once he was done with them, but the houses would have to pay his price, not barge in violently. Expecting his servants would do quick work of the intruder, the spider focused his attention back on his work. Several of his mechadendrites reached for the head of his subject, peeling away the skin around the skull and storing it away for later analysis before carefully breaking apart the bone underneath. This was the true prize. In his research thus far, the brains of the house's members always bore the signs of the enhancements that had been wrought upon their genes. No matter what transformation they had gone through, they needed to be able to control it, lest they destroy themselves or reveal their true nature to the Imperium. In the past, he had dissected brains that only marginally resembled those of human beings at all. It was fascinating, really, how the unfettered had guided the houses into altering themselves. Every strain was different, and he wondered as to the intent behind that diversity. This specimen's brain had no doubt been damaged by the brutal method by which it had been slain. The blow had been violent enough that the spider had required extra care to avoid driving splinter of bone into the brain. But it would still be of use. As the skull cracked and came apart, each piece held by several mechadendrites, the spider idly wondered how much longer it would take for his guards to finish dealing with the intruder. He could still hear the sounds of battle. He was actually starting to get concerned. A single intruder should not give his defenses that much trouble. Then the noise ended, and he allowed himself a moment of relief, just as the door to his laboratory burst open, blasted inward as if by some terrible explosion. Customized defense protocols he had embedded into his systems reacted at once, and the spider leapt from his position hunched over the dissection table, scattering his samples to the floor in the process. Blood and fluids leaked from broken containers and through the grated floor, joining the morass of repugnant liquid below. Strength flooded through his body as emergency power sources activated, kicking his augmetics into overdrive. His perception of time slowed as the cogitators that supplemented his organic brain were pushed to the very limit of their capabilities. The tools at the end of his mechadendrites shifted gears, safeties on examination tools being removed. The spider's legs buried themselves into the ceiling, which had been reinforced to be able to withstand his tremendous weight. That security measure had been taken after the second time he had to rebuild his lab from scratch, when one of the containment tanks had broken and a flow of acid had dissolved pretty much everything in the room, including the spider's legs, which had barely carried him to safety before breaking apart. Several of the tanks in this room held even more dangerous materials, and the spider wasn't going to go through that again. Even as he moved to his new position, his senses were already scanning the wrecked entrance. In the time it took him to anchor himself, he had already analyzed what the various auspexes that had replaced his mundane perceptions were telling him, not that it made much sense. Thermal imagery showed him a humanoid figure striding through the entrance, but the exact temperature kept changing, going up and down from levels that could melt steel to cold enough to kill an unprotected human instantly. Empiric sensors were also fluctuating wildly, though they never went completely down. Echolocation readings in the entire room had gone mad the moment the figure had stepped in. As for the video feeds, they were glitching whenever they tried to fix on the intruder. Only the living eyes that ended 3 of his mechadendrites, a feat of bioengineering he was quite proud of, could see it clearly, showing him a figure of blue fire and black crystal. Behind that figure were the charred and broken corpses of his battle servitors. They sparked and twitched, their primitive minds still trying to fulfill their orders even as their systems shut down. The spider didn't spare them more than a single thought, focusing on the intruder that had broken through all of his defenses so quickly and easily. Was this a demon, summoned by one of the Hive's warp-crazed cults? He had never actually encountered one of the Neverborn, though he had heard from the demon-hunting squads that only living eyes could properly see them. It was why he had gone through the trouble of keeping a few, even though they were usually vastly inferior to augmetic replacements. The fact that only these could see the creature clearly seemed to confirm that this was indeed a demon, And yet, there was something about the way it moved that made the spider think that this, whatever it was, had once been a mortal man, subject to the same limitations he himself had left behind. Long blades of black crystal suddenly appeared in the intruder's hands, manifesting from thin air. They looked fragile, but the spider needed only remember the wreckage that his servants had become to know not to underestimate these strange weapons. With a thought, he opened fire on the intruder, arcs of energy and streams of projectiles bursting from his mechadendrites. The intruder dodged the volleys by a hair's breadth, moving with impossible speed and precision. It leapt at the spider, contorting in the air to avoid the rest of the heretic's weapons. The two ebony blades buried themselves into the spider, cutting through his armored body as if it were paper. The spider screamed as he felt true pain for the first time since he had embraced his current form. The intruder let go of the swords, which broke inside the spider's body, the shards tearing through his circuits. Heretic and Warborn horror both fell down together, crashing to the ground. The fire-wreathed figure left the twitching heretic and walked toward the dissection table, miraculously intact despite the devastation that had ravaged the rest of the room. The spider heard a wet tearing sound, then another. Having accomplished whatever it was it had come to do, the intruder started marching toward the exit, without even looking at its defeated foe. "Tell me," called the spider from where he laid, sparks and fluids leaking from his broken form. The Vox speakers were crackling with static as they shut down, one by one. "Tell me what you are. Are you the Unfettered's final work? Has he succeeded? Are you a god?" The figure paused, and knelt next to the twitching spider. Its burning eyes stared into one of the spider's few remaining optics, and it spoke in a voice sounding like that of a mortal man, but echoed as if he were shouting from within a vast cavern. "I am the will of the god of change, the great mutator. Nothing more, nothing less." A hand of blue fire and black crystal reached down, a single finger running across the surface of the spider's outer casing. A spark flickered as the crystal ground against the metal. Static drowned all of the spider's senses for a few seconds. When it cleared, the figure was standing again. "I am an instrument of the divine," it continued, and the spider was almost sure he could hear something that sounded like weariness in its tone. "And you are nothing but a stepping stone on my path to retribution. Take solace in the fact that in death, you serve a greater purpose than anything you ever accomplished in life. It is all mortals can ever truly hope for." The spider was still considering these words when the last of his life support systems finally failed, and his remaining flesh died. Without a body to anchor it into the materium, his soul, a gnarled, twisted thing of jagged edges and blazing ambition, slipped into the Empyrean, where the hungry maws of 1,000 never-born spawned by his cruelty awaited him. The moment he died, the warp energy that had leapt from Alaric's finger to the spider's metallic body began to act. Unopposed by the natural resistance of a mortal soul, however weak that would have been in the case of the spider's corrupt spirit, it altered the metal on a fundamental level. Infused with a seed of pure potential, the augmetics of the spider began to bubble and melt, forming a pool of black liquid from which infernal faces peered at the outside world. When the next warband came to trade, they found the lair of the spider silent, its gates broken and its defenses missing. Sensing the opportunity for plunder, they went in, and died, devoured by the living, demon-possessed metal that flowed from the floor, walls and ceiling. Only one managed to escape, and he spent the next weeks spreading tales of how the spider's experiments had finally gotten the better of him, creating a monster that had killed him and now haunted his lair. Several other warbands would try to enter the lair, thinking to capture or kill the monster and claim the spider's loot. After the 7th massacre, the rest of the hive's forces gave up, and the area was abandoned to Alaric's accidental creation. Left alone, the living metal hardened into a shell, within which the warped remains of the spider's biological body began to mutate, a slow, complicated process that would not be completed for many, many years. For the schemes of Zionch were manifold, and none were ever obvious. Olga Petrov relaxed in his chair, taking in the sounds of wild partying and cruel laughter from all around him. Life was good, he reflected as he took another sip of his cup, filled with the finest mixture the chemical distilleries of Hive Heringrad could produce. It tingled on his tongue and burned his throat as it went down, and as he licked his lips, he felt the familiar rush of heat and pleasure spreading from his core throughout his entire body. Life had become very good indeed since he had accepted House Kernagreek's offer, all these years ago. With their help, he had risen through the gang's hierarchy, ultimately replacing its boss after strangling him with his bare hands, while the rest of the gang watched, their complicity bought with the gifts of his associates. Things had changed greatly since the end of Imperial rule on Achilles, of course. House Kernagreek had told him that he would have to turn against the Imperium at some point, not during their first offer, but years later, when he had been in too deep to turn back. That hadn't disturbed him. What had the God Emperor ever done for him? At least the Kernagreek envoys had given him what they promised in exchange for their service, unlike the Ecclesiarchy's fat priests, who had demanded blind obedience and offered nothing in return but threats of damnation. Once, Ulgo and his gang had been thieves, fences, vice peddlers and racketeers, extorting money and supplies from the population of the Underhive in return for their protection. Now they were enforcers for the new lords of Heringrad, the house that had risen to the top of the local pyramid during the brutal conflict that had followed the ousting of the false emperor's representatives. It was still much the same thing, keep the workers down and ensure they didn't get any strange ideas, except now they didn't have to hide from the Arbits. They could act openly with impunity, and they took advantage of it every chance they got. Which was why they reveled in this party inside the very remnants of the Arbits' stronghold, when before they had been forced to skulk in shadows. The gang was responsible with managing one of the chemical refineries, where the production of the mines outside the Hive City was treated and refined into more complex chemical compounds. Even if they didn't work the refineries themselves, the gangers were still exposed to the fumes, causing many of them to fall sick and die, but there were advantages to the job as well. They were allowed by House Kernagreek to take a part of the refinery's production for themselves, turning it into chems and drugs the likes of which they could never have enjoyed before. And since their lifespan was already reduced by their work, they might as well enjoy their life as much as they could. Of course, Ulgo himself didn't work in the refinery, that was his minion's job. And if they died because of it, well, there were plenty more potential recruits among the workers. Men were always willing to join the ranks of the oppressors rather than remain victims. Men and women in rough clothing, all of them armed, none of them older than 30 standard years, laughed and shouted as they drank and smoked. Disharmonicums blared from mounted speakers, sending stabs of pain into the brains of those not used to them while triggering the adrenal glands of those who were. Cages hung from the ceiling, the skin of their captives pierced by countless needles, all of them connected to tubes that went up to the cage's bizarre crowns. These prisoners were gifts from Ulgo's patrons, enemies of House Kernagreek who had been transformed into living drug factories. Their entire physiologies had been reworked so that while they still looked the same, every organ in their bodies now produced various stimulants. Even their hearts were used as mixing chambers, and every breath burned them as their lungs were used to cool the concoctions mixed in their blood, or so Ulgo had been told. His knowledge of the human body was limited to ending its function and inflicting pain upon it. Of course, after such a transformation, it was impossible for the captives to survive on their own. Separated from the machines attached atop their cages, they would die in minutes. But they still lived, still thought, and judging by the constant moans of agony, they still suffered. Their pained cries were almost impossible to hear above the speakers, but Ulgo's senses were sharpened by the several cocktails he had already imbibed tonight, and he could pick up each scream. The machines kept them alive and unable to end themselves, but their makers had no concern for easing the suffering of their victims, quite the contrary, in fact. None crossed House Kernagreek and did not pay the price for their foolishness. Ulgo appreciated the drugs extracted from these wretches, but he was also acutely aware of the hidden meaning behind this gift. His associates wanted him to remember what the price of defying them would be. Fortunately, it had the same effect on his subordinates. There had been no challenge to his authority since the Planetary Rebellion. Of course, that could also be attributed to his own efforts to secure their loyalty rather than the fear inspired by the cage's constant reminders. His gaze passed over the room, and froze. There, right in the middle of the floor, stood a figure that hadn't been here before. The shape of a man, rendered in blue fire and black crystal, faced Ulgo's throne, utterly motionless save for the flickering flames. Slowly, others began to notice the intruder, until everyone in the room was staring at it. With a sharp gesture, Ulgo silenced the speakers, and commanded his people to draw their weapons, but not to attack. This creature, whatever it was, hadn't made a hostile move yet. It had simply waited for them to notice it. Ulgo had never seen anything like it, but perhaps it was a messenger, summoned by one of the Hive City's magicians. It was unlikely the message was good, given the messenger's aspect, yet considering the nature of his patrons, it was better not to risk offending them. "Welcome," Algo called out, projecting a perfect image of calm and supreme confidence. "Your method of entry was unconventional, but I am willing to forgive the intrusion. What are you, and what do you want with us?" The figure raised the helmet that served as its head, staring directly at Algo. The gang leader's grip unconsciously tightened around his throne's armrests as that inhuman gaze seemed to penetrate his soul. He could see things in that burning gaze, things he could not understand, but that filled him with dread. He didn't turn away from it, though. He could not show such weakness to his gang. "Olga Petrov," it said, slowly, as if tasting the name. The gangers closest to it actually recoiled at the sheer inhumanity of its voice. It raised its right arm, its hand closing in an armored fist with a single finger accusingly pointed at Algo. "The eyes of the dead have brought me to you. You are a servant of House Kernagreek, and for that, you have been marked for death, like all their other pawns." "I am no pawn," growled Algo. "I am an associate of House Kernagreek, not a slave. What you believe yourself to be is irrelevant. Only the truth matters to those such as I." "You think you are the first monsters sent to kill me?" mocked Algo, spreading his arms wide. "I know I am the last," it replied. "For my true prey is one far greater than you." "We will see about that," sneered the gang lord, before pressing a rune on his throne's armrest. A chorus of groans and hissing sounds rose from all across the rooms as the injector attached on the neck of every member of Algo's gang activated, pumping a dose of combat drugs into their system. This was how Algo had ensured the gang's loyalty, by making himself the ultimate drug dealer in their minds, the only one who could give them their fix with a single push of a button. The injectors could not be tampered with, at least not by those already enthralled to the mixtures they dispensed. Some of these fighters were so far gone that they weren't even able to inject themselves with drugs manually, with syringes and needles. To them, he was a god, and they lived and died to do his bidding. And as for those who still could, the drugs they could obtain by themselves paled in comparison to what Algo made sure the injectors were filled with. They twitched as the rush overwhelmed their senses for a second before sharpening them, fueling their aggression. "Kill that freak, boys," barked Algo, settling back into his throne, a smirk on his lips. There were more than 200 people in the room, of whom about half were fighters, the rest were waiters, toys, and hanger-ons. It was only a fraction of the criminal empire Algo had controlled before the fall of Achilles, and was still less than 1/100th of the forces he still commanded now, but that would be more than enough. In fact, this was almost certainly overkill, but Algo hadn't reached his current position by being afraid of making a statement. Nor was he willing to risk underestimating an enemy possessed of such obvious sorcery. The first blood was spilled when an enormous brute of a man launched himself at the figure, arms spread wide, seeking to knock it down. The armored gauntlets struck like snakes, catching the giant and turning his momentum against him. The brute flipped head over heels, the intruder guiding his fall so that a rusted knife held in one of the other assailants pushed into his eye socket and brain. The fiend let go of the twitching corpse just as a ganger struck at it from behind with a weapon made from an industrial saw attached to his wrist. It dodged without looking, causing the blade to bury itself into the chest of a blue-haired madman with scissors for hands. Only then did it struck a blow of its own, with a long sword of obsidian that had appeared right in its hand. The head of the first ganger flew in the air, still wearing an expression of dumb shock at having killed his comrade. Even as it butchered all who attacked it, the intruder kept slowly approaching Algo's throne, one step at a time. Beginning to panic, Algo pressed another rune, causing the injectors to pump their most potent cocktail into his guards. Few of them would survive the crashing down, but it couldn't be helped. They would die to protect him, and experience a touch of divine strength in their final moments. It was an honor, really. These drugs hadn't come cheap. The walls of the stronghold vibrated at the strength of the scream that came out of the gangers as the new cocktail was injected into their bloodstream. They rushed the intruder in a wave of maddened flesh, their faces distorted into grimaces of pleasure and bloodlust. 7 of them died instantly, cut apart by more obsidian blades, but eventually, through sheer weight of number and lack of self-preservation, they managed to bring the intruder to the ground. They piled on it, stabbing and kicking and punching, forming a mound of bodies where those on the outside clawed and raged in their hunger to get to their designated victim. On his throne, Algo smiled. Then there was a terrible sound, like glass shearing through bone, and spikes of black crystal burst from the mass of bodies, spilling blood and guts as they pierced the gangers and lifted them into the air before breaking under their weight and falling back to the ground. And there, surrounded by the torn bodies of Ulgo's people, was the armored fiend, staring straight at the gang leader, looking none the worse for bear. It took another step, its crystalline boot crushing a throat as it landed. That was it for Ulgo. He ran from the room, through the secret exit he had discovered when he had first come to claim the stronghold as his own after the rebels' troops were done with it. He ran without looking back, not caring for the sound of rent flesh and the screams of ecstatic pain as the gangers kept attacking the monster in their midst, driven beyond caring for their lives by the drugs thundering in their blood. Sweat ran down his face, and his heart pounded in his chest, not from the effort, for despite it all Ulgo had taken care to remain physically fit, it was from utter dread. A black car waited for him when he emerged from the passage, right where he had left it, its Prometheum tank full, the emblems of the Arbits painted over with the sigil of House Koenigsegg. He jumped inside, his fingers pressing the activation sequence faster than ever before in spite of how much they trembled. The engine roared to life, and Ulgo pushed it to its limits, causing the craft to accelerate to 100 kilometers an hour within a few seconds. He fled through the streets of Heringrad, on roads that were now used only by those favored enough by Achilles' lords to still own a personal transport. The rest walked from their sleeping holes to their working station every day, and woe betide any who arrived late for their shift. Rockreat roads and bridges allowed passage from one level of the hive to the next, and the markings on his car would prevent him from having any trouble with the watchers guarding the checkpoints, posted high above the roads with auspexes, cogitators capable of identifying whether a vehicle was allowed in their sector in a few heartbeats, and missile launchers in case it was not. Ulgo only started to breathe a little easier when the walls of Spire Koenigseg's outer perimeter came into view. As long as he reached them, he would be safe, he told himself. Not even the demon that had butchered his gang would dare attack the domain of one of the houses. Clinging to the underside of Ulgo's transport, the shadow-shrouded form of Valeric waited. The living came to Koenigsegg Spire in their hundreds, slaves, servants and supplicants, to deliver their tributes of wealth, information and blood. Spies returning from rival cities crept through hidden doorways, nursing the wounds they had sustained in the course of duty, their minds filled with stolen secrets. Resources once stored in distant warehouses were now stockpiled in the spire itself, in levels once filled with quarters for now dead servants. Dark priests whose words swayed congregations of thousands came to prostrate themselves before lords who did not worship their gods, bringing them the choicest part of their faithful's tribute. Fear was the dominant emotion in those throngs of supplicants, for not all who entered the spire came out of it alive. The corpse lords were as cruel as any house of Achilles, and they loved to make examples of their victims. The bodies of those who had failed the house were on display, impaled on the spikes of the spire, their souls bound to their bodies by Koenigsegg warlocks until their remains decayed enough for them to fall off. Only then would their spirits be released. Many queued in long files before the gates, waiting to be inspected and allowed entrance. Even the spies, who walked unseen by any, must speak secret words for the hidden doors to open before them, and they had to submit themselves to scanners that knew the gene code of every soul allowed to enter through the gate they kept. The spire was vast, and had hundreds of entrances on its first dozen levels, the only ones accessible without a flying transport, all of them watched and defended, one way or another. There were hundreds more levels to the spire, but between the hidden passages and the sealed and collapsed sections, no one knew exactly how many. On the third to last level, Valder Koenigsegg, patriarch and undisputed master of his house, was scowling. It was an expression he often wore these days, and it did his cadaverous visage no favor. Already ancient when the unfettered had reached out to Achilles, Valder was a dreadful sight. Clad in the most elegant, and expensive, finery available to imperial nobility, he looked like a regal corpse left to dry in the sun of a dead planet for a few weeks before being dragged back and prepared for entombing by an expert undertaker. Only his piercing, glowing blue eyes belied his appearance, as well as the haze of barely contained power and the faint scent of ozone that surrounded him at all time. By all rights, Valder should not have survived the Koenigsegg transformation process. And indeed, one could argue that he had not. It was only through a continuous effort of will that Valder's ancient, diseased heart still beat. Rejuvenation treatments could only do so much, especially for one suffering from as many genetic defects as the patriarch. The noble bloodlines of Achilles had tried to avoid interbreeding too much, but with the pride in their purity held by the world's aristocracy, accidents were inevitable. They were usually locked away from sight, or quietly disappeared. At least only Valda's body had suffered from the effects of such consanguinity. His mind had been sharper than any other of his generation. Several of his organs had failed him before he had been 10 years old, and he had had to spend weeks every year in the care of physicians as they removed tumors from his flesh. His bones had been frail as glass, and the tiniest exposure would result in him developing all manners of afflictions. It had been a great effort to keep him alive, one that his family had only spent because of the potential the then patriarch had seen in him. That long-dead forebear had been right, for despite all of this, Valda now ruled Heringrad's mightiest house. He had been patriarch for decades, leading his house into betrayal with barely a pause to consider the consequences. Valda had been alive to see the orcs torture and devour his kin. He would have done anything to never be that helpless again. But with power had come new responsibilities, which was why he scowled so much. With the chains of the Imperium cast off, all of the governor's power and duties were without holders. And with many of the nobility's servants dead one way or another, those who wanted to seize influence, rather than mere physical strength, must bear the weight of that work themselves or pass it off to slaves or trusted relatives. Valda had done both those things, but he still had to spend nearly every hour managing his growing empire. He stood now with his hands resting on a large circular table, upon which were pinned hundreds of parchment sheets, reports of household activities from all across Herengrad and beyond. Around him, the walls of his office were covered in weapons, ancient power swords used by the family's imperial army ancestors, brutish orc killing tools purchased at great expense, and all manners of trophies claimed during the planet's rebellion. Valda had ordered this display as a show of power, a reminder of the might his house now wielded. They had such little need of weapons that they could afford to have them on display like this instead of using them. His chief trophy was a plasma pistol, a relic from the Great Crusade that had once belonged to House Dartenbach's founder and which had been taken from that family's ruined spire after its destruction. The Patriarch's gaze moved from an accounting of the Manufactorum's latest output to a report of a cave-in in one of the mines where the rare elements that went into the Hive City's famed chemical distilleries were extracted. Production was up 5% compared to the last month, which was 11% less than what the new manager of the mines had promised him over the mangled body of his predecessor. He made a mental note to summon that particular great-nephew soon. Another note drew his eye, this one a report of the latest engagement in the east. Another squad of soldiers had been lost to the beasts of House Osentria. The only survivor who had made it back to camp had been utterly traumatized by what he had seen, forcing Valda's great-granddaughter to put him out of his misery before he brought morale even lower than it already was. The girl was asking for reinforcements, and not more soldiers, but actual house members who could meet Ozentria's hunters with their own exalted power. And these were but two of the dozens of pieces of information spread on the table. There were diplomatic communications from the houses with which Kernagreek wasn't at open war yet, transcripts of the latest babbles of the psychers kept under lock and key in a secret location in the chemical wastes, reports from his spies both outside the spire and within it. Unfettered grant me strength, murmured the Patriarch under his breath. There was a soft knock on the door, genuine wood, brought from off-world at a ludicrous cost, and Valda's manservant, secretary and bodyguard entered. The man could not have been more different from his master. He was young, fit, tall and handsome, with an utterly fake smile plastered on his face. He wore deceptively simple clothes that had cost more than an entire family of workers could make in a decade, back when Achilles nobles had actually paid their slaves, of course. "Sir," said Gabriel, "there is a visitor here to see you. It seems urgent." Gabriel belonged to House Lorenos, one of the Haringrad's 3 remaining noble families. Like House Taroden, House Lorenos was subordinate to House Kernagreek. Unlike their overlords, the members of House Lorenos could still pass for mere humans if they so wished. It was a trait of their particular strain of the unfettered gift that had spared them from the medical treatments and surgeries House Kernagreek had had to provide its science to hide their transformation until Revelation Day. Gabriel had been assigned to Valda's service after some sordid affair in his family's spire had made it uncomfortable for him to remain there, and Valda had needed a new secretary at the time after the unfortunate demise of the last one. So far, Gabriel's service had been impeccable, but Valda was still wary of him, just in case the whole thing had been a charade meant to allow a killer to get close to him. "Who is it, Gabriel? I am busy." "Someone named Olgo Petrov," answered Gabriel, showing no reaction to the vitriol in his master's voice. He knew all the correct passphrases to get past the guards, and he made enough of a fuss that they called for me to deal with him. After listening to him, I think you should see him, sir. "Olgo Petrov, you say? Remind me who that is?" "One of the scum from the underhive the house recruited before Revelation Day, my liege. He and his people are responsible for maintaining order among the cattle working in your refineries." "The refineries? Ah, yes, I remember now. His people do such passable work that his name never gets on the reports, which is good enough, I suppose. Why has he come here?" "Apparently, he was attacked by a creature from the beyond," said Gabriel. "It killed a lot of his gang, and he claims that it said it would come for all of House Kernagreek's associates." Valda frowned, or at least he tried to. He didn't have any eyebrow left, and the skin of his face was too taut to properly reflect his emotions. There were few things left on Achilles that could pose a threat to House Kernagreek, but powerful demons were among them. "You were right to bring this to my attention," said the Patriarch. "Get him inside and seal the door." Olgo Petrov looked pretty much exactly like Valda had expected him to. The only difference was that, while the man appeared as terrified as the Patriarch had imagined he would, the terror was only partially due to the fact that he stood in the Kernagreek Patriarch for the first time. If anything, he seemed calmer, now that he was in the spire. That wasn't common, and it made Valda take the story the gang leader told that much more seriously. Olgo told them of the attack on his gang, of the figure of black crystal and blue fire that had appeared out of nowhere and butchered his gangers. He was getting to his escape, glossing over how he had abandoned the rest of his gang to the creature, when he suddenly stopped. His eyes grew wide, and a blood stain blossomed on his chest, before he fell down face first, revealing the very fiend he had been describing standing right behind him. In its hand was a long spike of obsidian, covered in Olgo's heart blood. It dropped it, and the weapon shattered as it hit the floor. Gabriel moved at once, positioning himself between Valda and the intruder. But the Patriarch barely noticed his guard's action. His gaze was fixed onto the burning figure. All members of House Kernagreek were able to detect each other's presence, to gauge the relative strength of their gifts. It was an ability that served them well in the bloodline's endless power squabbles, and one that also allowed them to detect when sorcery was used near them, though they couldn't identify its purpose. And he could sense the creature's power, blazing from it like a beacon now that whatever trick it had used to hide itself from him was undone. "Only the servants of the unfettered wield such sorcerous power. What are you, spirit?" "Punishment. Not yours, but you are in my way." "You really should have honored the gods, Valda. Perhaps then my master would have set me on a different path to my true target." "How did you get in here? This place is warded against your kind." "No, Valda. It is not. For your pet warlocks have never encountered one such as me, or even conceived that I could exist. Their view is too limited for that. All their precious circles and spells have achieved is to conceal my presence here to the sight of your kin in the rest of this spire." It gestured to Olgo's corpse and continued, "I only needed to follow in the footsteps of this wretch to pass through the more mundane barriers, knowing that in his fear he would go straight for you." Valda clicked his tongue, annoyed that the spire's defenses had been breached so easily. He would need to have a chat with the warlocks and see how they could atone for that failure. But for now, Gabriel, dispose of that creature. "As you wish, sir," answered the bodyguard, relish evident in his tone. Gabriel let loose, his body tearing through his clothes as he transformed into House Loreno's true form. His muscles bulged, and 4 horns burst from his forehead, while his legs split in two. The change only took a few seconds, and by the end of it Gabriel was a 3 meters high, scarlet-skinned quadruped with a humanoid torso. He roared at the intruder, who didn't appear fazed in the slightest. Gabriel threw a massive arm at his enemy, who dodged the attack with ease before striking back with a new black sword. The crystalline weapon shattered upon Gabriel's skin, but a few of the shards broke through, embedding themselves into his flesh. The shapeshifter roared again, first in annoyance, then in surprise and genuine pain as the fragments buried themselves deeper into his arm. He struck again, and the assassin dodged the blow once more, throwing a pair of daggers that nicked Gabriel's forward legs. Seeing that the battle wasn't going as much in his bodyguard's favor as he had hoped, Valda reached to the weapon racks on the walls and took up a massive power hammer. The weapon looked ridiculously oversized in the frail old man's hands, but he wielded it with ease, his frame full of the eldritch power of House Kernagreek. He watched for a few seconds as Gabriel kept trying and failing to hit the flaming fiend, before seeing his opening and leaping into action, calling upon all the unfettered given strength of his body to move with lightning speed. The hammerhead flew, aimed directly at the back of the assassin's black helm. But Valda saw the trap too late. The assassin had somehow known about his attack before he had even started to move, and moved out of the hammer's path by the slightest of margins. Valda had no time to correct the hammer's course, and it slammed into Gabriel's skull. The power field and strength of the blow obliterated the head of Valda's servant, and Valda was left wide open for the assassin's counterattack. A spear of obsidian materialized out of nowhere into its hands, and it rammed the weapon into Valda's unarmored chest with enough strength to make him fall backward and pin him to the floor. Horrible pain spread through him as the spear's malign energies began to interfere with the power that kept him alive. Valda watched as his killer loomed over him. "I won't beg," spat the patriarch of House Kernagreek. "Yes," replied the burning fiend, "you will. But not to me." A descending obsidian claw was the last thing Valda saw with mortal eyes, before his soul slipped from his ruined body and into the Empyrean. The gods he had seen no point in praying to were there, waiting. And the creature had been right, he begged then. But it changed nothing. The transport touched down on one of Kernagreek Spire's many landing pads, and a figure emerged from it. It was a woman, tall and proud, wearing a purple robe over a black body glove. Long black hair fell on her left shoulder. The right side of her head was shaved and inscribed with hexagrammatic tattoos. In her right hand, she held a silver staff covered in thousands of tiny runes of power, all of them glowing with a crimson, baleful light. Her face was beautiful, but the intensity of her gaze rarely failed to make those who looked upon it uneasy. It was the gaze of one who has witnessed true power, and was no longer impressed by anything lesser. The workers on the landing bay shuddered as she glanced over them. Even the 3 members of House Kernagreek who had come to welcome her, all of them wielders of their bloodline's terrible strength, felt intimidated at her presence, though they had been the one to call her to their spire. She was the witch Marinia, born on Elder in the Wailing Storm, daughter of the Overlord who had ruled that world with an iron fist until the coming of the Forsaken Sons. Along with her father, she had been part of that world's great conspiracy that had sought to create an army worthy of being taken by the Chaos Marines, and she had been rewarded for her service with knowledge and power that set her above all but a few of the Warband's non-Astartes minions. She had fought alongside the mortal armies of the Chaos Marines during her conquest of the Wailing Storm, unleashing her sorcery on a dozen different worlds and rising to a position of fearful leadership among the cults and armies they had amassed. Before the beginning of the Black Crusade, when the separate hosts of the Forsaken Sons had gathered once more, she had been sent to the Unfettered, to assist him both in his research and in managing the planet for which he had been given responsibility. With the Unfettered spending most of his time aboard the Truthful Gate, having little interest in the day-to-day affairs of Achilles, and the other Forsaken Sons on the ship sharing that lack of interest for mortal dealings, the work had fallen on Marinia. On her arrival, she had needed to incinerate a few nobles before the rest had started taking her seriously, but now, there were none on Achilles who doubted her power or the fact that when she spoke, she did so with the Forsaken Sons' authority. Behind her came 2 hulking figures, their muscles bulging beneath their leather armor, their heads covered by mind junction units whose controls were directly linked to Marinia's bracelet. They were a gift from the Unfettered, to help keep her safe while she did his work. Unlike most of the Fleshmaster's creations, they were wholly mortal, created for a purpose other than the Unfettered's quest for transcendence. The trio of Kernagreek nobles knelt as she approached. She glared at them for a few seconds, before saying, "Tell me what you know." As they walked through the corridors of the spire toward the scene of the battle, the 3 nobles took it in turn to fill in Marinia about what they already knew. 3 hours ago, their patriarch had received one of his distant subordinates in his office, accompanied as always by his bodyguard. After an hour had passed, one of the servants finally dared to enter the room, bringing a pile of new reports, and had been confronted by a scene of carnage, with both Patriarch Valda, his guard and his visitor dead. The servant had rushed out, terrified, and spread the alarm. The spire had been put on lockdown and, after several tense moments, the 3 nobles closest to the Patriarch's position had agreed not to kill each other for the throne yet and first find out who had killed him. They had contacted the Truthful Gate using the emergency codes each house had been entrusted with, asking for help investigating the matter, as none of them felt that anyone the others knew could be trusted with this matter. In truth, they did not truly believe that one of them was responsible for the Patriarch's demise, for they thought that if such a conspiracy had been able to muster strength enough to kill Valda in his own home, its leader would also have arranged matters for his succession to be immediate. Yet as things stood, it would be many days before House Kernagreek chose a new Patriarch. They were the first house of Achilles to lose its leader and survive since Revelation Day. The three nobles, called Friedrich, Acres, and Leifix, were respectively the grandson, nephew and great-great-grandson of the dead Patriarch. Amidst the viper pit of intrigues and competition for status that was House Kernagreek, they were three of the most favored. Friedrich and Acres were direct lieutenants of Valda, entrusted with managing one slice of the house's domain with relatively little oversight. As for Leifix, he had returned to Herengrad this very morning from the west, where he had led several raids against the holdings of House Etherin. The youngest member of the trio had risen quickly through the family's hierarchy after Revelation Day, displaying a strategic mind that had served the house well in the battles against the Imperial forces left on Achilles. They reached the end of a long corridor decorated with thousands of portraits, all the members of House Kernagreek who had ever lived, with some of the paintings being impeccable recreations of those destroyed by the Orcs centuries prior. Ahead of them was the elevator that would bring them to the Patriarch's office. The gates opened as soon as the console recognized Leifix's gene code. The elevators of Spire Kernagreek were reserved for the use of house members, the servants either taking the stairs or the mass conveyors. Suspended in the center of the elevator's gilded insides by a few scraps of torn cloth was an antique plasma pistol, half dismantled and with its power cell whirring. "What the?" said Leifix, before the broken weapon detonated in a ball of starfire that engulfed him, followed by his kinsman and Marinia's escorts a fraction of a second later. Marinia only survived because of the precautions she had taken before descending on Achilles. Just before the wave of superheated air reached her ahead of the actual plasma, one of her ring cracked, releasing the demon bound within. The formless spirit cloaked itself around the witch, protecting her from the explosion, but not from its breath. Marinia was sent flying backward almost 30 meters before she managed to stop her momentum with a short incantation and landed gracefully on her feet. She blinked as her guardian demon released her, the terms of its bounding sending it immediately back to the Sea of Souls now that it had performed its function. She looked around her sharply. No guards were in sight, of course. Typical of Achilles nobility, to relegate guards to simply keeping watch over the spire's entrance and trust their own protection to the power bestowed upon them by the unfettered. The explosion would have been heard, and someone would be sent to investigate, but with the size of the spire and the ever-diminishing number of people inhabiting it, she could not rely on reinforcements to keep her safe. She was on her own, which had never been her strongest suit. But life among the Forsaken Sons had hardened her in ways even her life on Elder, first as a daughter of the Overlord taught by the best sorcerers of the Empire and then as an explorer of the Drakencraft estate, had not. She sensed something behind her, a ripple in Achilles' much tormented ether. She turned, staff raised, the first syllable of an incantation already on her lips, but froze when she saw the figure of black crystal and azure fire standing some 20 meters behind her. Her sorceress perceptions, expanded to heights she hadn't previously believed possible during her training by her masters in the Coven, recognized the soul within the flames. She had last seen it on Elder, in the final moments before the arrival of the Forsaken Sons. Back then, she had thought the Chaos Marines to be gods, and while she had learned much about them since then, she still thought she had done the smart thing in joining her father's conspiracy and ensuring that they earned the favor of Lord Archon. "Alaric?" she said, keeping her staff aimed at the creature. "Is that you?" "Marinia," it answered. "It has been a long time, though much longer for me than for you." The voice was indeed that of Alaric. The witch was well familiar with it, for she had been a member of the same party of explorers as the man for many months before all members of that group had died. Back then, Alaric had been the group's leader, and she had followed his lead gladly, until he had refused to accept the inevitable and she had struck him down from behind. Even then, he had been dangerous, willing to use any trick to accomplish his goals. Now, what happened to you? She asked, her mind whirling as she sought a way out of the situation. "I have been reforged by the fires of Zeonch," replied Alaric. "When you killed me, my soul was consigned to the realm of chaos, but the god of change chose to spare me dissolution into the Empyrean's tides. Nor was I consigned to the rings of Sortiarius, where the victims of betrayal scream forevermore. Instead, the great mutator remade me. He poured the power of his fire into my soul, clad me in armor forged of his own solidified blood, and sent me back into the materium. At the mention of the architect of fate's name, Marinia suddenly recognized the symbols inscribed on Alaric's armor. She had seen them used in the rituals of the coven. They indeed belonged to Zionch, and if her interpretation of these particular sigils was correct, they were less a mark of favor and more a brand of ownership. Then why are you here? Have you come to seek revenge? Revenge was the prize promised to me by the god of lies. The flames within the eye sockets of Alaric's helm flickered briefly, as if in reaction to the bitter irony of what he had just said. But it is not the sole purpose for which I have been sent to this benighted world. And what purpose would that be? She pressed on. If the god of change had sent one agent set on a course opposed to the unfettered's one, then there would be more after she defeated Alaric. She needed to know why he was there in the first place, so that she could bring this information to her Astartes masters. The Forsaken Sons had enjoyed the patronage of the Four since their foundation. If that had changed, then they must be informed, lest the treachery of the gods bring ruin upon them. The Black Crusade was raging across the Azarok sector with little opposition, and she had been taught that it was always when chaos was triumphant that the divisions between the dark gods manifested in the worst ways possible. You do not need to know that, Marinia. All you need to know is that you will die, here and now, and that even your death will be nothing more than a step in the schemes of greater beings. Are you not happy? I finally embraced the truth you talked about after you betrayed me. Sorcerous lightning leapt from Marinia's weapon, but Alaric dodged the blow, moving preternaturally fast. As he charged toward her, she twirled her staff and rammed it on the floor, channeling her power through the very stones of Spycarna Greek. She shouted a word of power, forcing the infernal language through her teeth, and grasping hands of wood and stone burst from the floor, grasping at Alaric's legs, seeking to pull him down to the ground, where they would tear him apart. He leapt away from them, and Marinia gestured with her left hand, ripping several blocks of stone from the wall and sending them flying at Alaric, tearing a dozen priceless paintings to shreds in the process. Alaric reached out with his clawed hand, extending one armored finger. The moment it touched the stone, it dissolved into sand, and the reborn spirit emerged from the cloud undamaged, landing on his feet less than 10 meters away from Marinia now. She screamed then, shouting words of such power that it burned her mind to speak them. Bloody tears appeared on the skin of her arms and face, and she felt more on the rest of her body. Marinia was no psyker, she had no innate ability to manipulate the energies of the warp. Instead, she must use the dark lore accumulated by centuries of experimentation on Elder, compounded by the knowledge of the Forsaken Sons sorcerers. In truth, while she resented the psyker's easy summoning of the warp's awesome power, she believed that sorcery was and always would be superior. It was both more reliable, and the prerogative of those with the strength of will and intellect to master it, rather than the random product of chance or the whim of the gods. It did, however, mean that she had to pay for every spell she cast, and the one she now unleashed on Alaric had a steep price indeed, matching its potency. A wave of crimson lightning leapt from her staff, so large that it filled the entire space of the corridor. The portraits it touched were burned to ash and less than ash, with only one of them remaining unburned, but not unchanged, for the regal figure it had depicted before was now a hideous feathered beast-man. As the storm was about to reach him, Alaric thrust his arms forward, and a barrier of black crystal burst from his hands. When the eldritch lightning struck this obstacle, it detonated in a flash of light so bright Marinia was temporarily blinded. When her vision returned, she was on her back, lying on the ground. She blinked, and realized that she could no longer feel anything beneath her neck. Forcing her eyes down, she saw a massive spike of obsidian piercing her throat, gnashing against her spinal column. She could also glimpse her hands, still holding the pieces of her broken staff. Blood was flowing from her wound, and she knew that she would be dead soon. Alaric walked toward her, his armor fuming from the conflagration but otherwise seeming none the worse for wear. She tried to speak, but she could say nothing. Yet she thought that Alaric understood her, for he shook his head, just once, before the darkness came in and Marinia of Elder perished. "My lord, the transport of Lady Marinia is incoming." Raksha the Black-Clawed grunted in response to the crew member's announcement, and turned his gaze on the screen showing the gunship's approach. The Forsaken Sun was the only Astartes on the bridge of the Truthful Gate, surrounded by mortals, mutants, and Dark Mechanicum thralls. He despised this duty as much as he understood its importance. There must always be one of Lord Arkan's warriors on the bridge, just in case, but he would much rather be down in the ship's dark corridors, hunting the warp spawn with his brothers. The Truthful Gate's infernal denizens were a challenge worthy of a former son of Horus, and there was much amusement to be found in putting them down. There were never two of the same shape. Jabal, one of the other 8 warriors who had been tasked by the Awakened One to accompany the Unfettered and assist him in his designs, liked to keep track of the different kinds of abomination they encountered on the vessel. His book of sketches and descriptions already had several hundreds of them. He was planning to trade it to one of the Coven's warlocks when they reunited with the rest of the Warband, though he hadn't told Raksha what he intended to ask for in exchange. The Black-Clawed couldn't imagine what the sorcerers could possibly want with his brother's scribbles. They had been in orbit of the killers for several months now. It was strange to be able to measure the passage of time precisely again, after so long in the Wailing Storm, fighting to bring its worlds under the aegis of the Forsaken Suns. Those had been good times, thought Raksha as he watched the transport of the Unfettered's Pet Witch finish its approach to the ship's hangar bay. He had earned his nickname during that crusade, when his right arm had been torn off by one of the demonic minions of the Sorcerer Emperors of Nhitos, just before his bolt shell had pulverized its summoner's skull, banishing it back to the Sea of Souls. The heretics had built him a new arm from the melted blades of the Sorcerer's Praetorian Guard, and it was stronger and more deadly than the old one ever had been. During the Battle of Silberstadt, he had used its claws to cut off the head of an Imperial Navy captain after he and his squad mates had fought their way through his ship, the very deed for which they had been bestowed the honor of serving of honor guard to the Chosen. And now, here he was, reduced to watching screens while the rest of the Warband prepared to fight the armies of the false Emperor across the rest of the sector. He frowned. Something was wrong. The transport was approaching the docking bay's entrance, but it was not slowing down. "Contact the Witch's craft," he commanded the Vox officer. "Tell them to slow down at once." "They aren't responding our hails, my lord," replied the mortal. It took only 1 second for the Chaos Marine to realize what was going on. Scowling, he opened a direct link to the landing bay's overseer, one of the Unfettered's pets, a half-breed warp spawn called Akris. "Get ready. Marinia's transport has been compromised," he shouted before the creature could say anything. "You are about to be boarded." On the screen, he saw the craft crash land into the docking bay, skimming on the floor in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. A couple servitors were too slow in getting out of the way, and were obliterated before the wreck came to a stop by slamming into the wall facing the void. Akris and a squad of 10 mortal soldiers approached it, weapons raised while coolant fluid was dumped on it to prevent the flames from spreading. Suddenly, the transport's hatch burst open, and a shapeless mass of fanged, tentacled flesh emerged. It was the size of a dreadnought, and it shrugged off the last beams of Akris' squad without appearing to take any damage. The screen didn't have sound, but Raksha could well imagine the screams of terror and pain as the monster leapt onto the squad and began to tear them apart, stuffing the bloody pieces into its mouths. Akris lifted in the air, gathering warp energy around its hands, and then its head was struck off its shoulders by a bladed tentacles. Raksha swore violently, and opened a new Vox link to the rest of his battle brothers. Intrusion in the landing bay. Chaos spawn. Get there, contain and suppress. A brief chorus of affirmative replies told him that his message had been heard. The Forsaken Sons aboard the Truthful Gate were converging to the landing bay. Raksha ached to join them, but his orders were clear: someone had to remain on the bridge. He cursed again as the screen went dark, the wall-embedded servitor that had provided the feed crushed by a thrown piece of meat. The one time something interesting happened on this watch, and he couldn't even see it. Alaric closed the hatch behind him, and dropped into the Truthful Gate. After setting the transport on a crash course, he had jumped out of it, arranging his trajectory to take him to the ship's outer hold. Then, it had been easy to find a hatch and force it open. The Truthful Gate's integrity was already compromised in several places, its atmosphere maintained by sorcery more than technology. As long as he closed the hatch behind him quickly, no alarm would be raised. This was the final step of Alaric's mission, the true purpose behind all the killing he had performed so far. He did not know what would happen to him after he was done, but he did not care. To be more precise, he could not care. Zyonch's reforging had taken everything from him but his cunning and his desire for vengeance. With Marinia dead, he was now little more than a tool of the Changer of the Ways, an arrow let loose at a specific target. He had to kill the unfettered. His ability to hide from sight would not serve him here. The corridors of the Truthful Gate were full of wild warp energy and mindless demons, spawned by the experiments performed on this ship. Suffering and madness permeated every surface, and the echoes of distant screams never faded away. The only reason there weren't worse things stalking the ship was that, according to the memories Alaric had gleaned from Marinia's eyes, the Chaos Marines who followed the unfettered spent most of their time purging them before they could fully mature. This was hell. But unlike the realm of chaos from which Alaric had descended, this nightmare had been created by mortal hands. And here, the shadows would not hide him, for there already were others dwelling within them. He would need to get to his target while glowing like a candelabra in a lordling's feasting hall. But he had known that would be the case. The creatures his warping touch had made from the servitors crewing the transport would ensure that the ship's defenders were focused on the hangar bay, but Alaric needed no precognition to know that this distraction would last long. He ran through the corridors of the Truthful Gate, using the knowledge of the witch to guide his steps. He had been instilled with knowledge of Achilles before being sent to the planet, but that knowledge had been limited, showing him only the first step to the lair of the heretic calling himself the Spider. After that, he had been expected to learn by himself what his path was supposed to be. In truth, Alaric remembered precious little of the time between his death on Elder, alone, betrayed and faced with his world's doom, and his arrival on Achilles. He suspected this was deliberate, as well as merciful, in a very practical way. To operate in the mortal universe, he needed to be able to think as he once had, rather than as he dimly remembered having learned to in Zyonch's realm. He did remember some things, though even these recollections were muddled, made to fit his now mortal mind. He remembered fire burning away his flesh, or perhaps his flesh turning to flame. He remembered the black armor being affixed onto him by pink-skinned fiends that never stopped giggling. He remembered being made to kneel before a great well, and commanded to drink a single drop from its swirling waters. No more, they had warned him, though who they had been was lost to him as well. He remembered standing before the Court of Change, and looking up, at. His awareness snapped back to the present, his limited mind rebelling at the continuation of that memory. The Truthful Gate wasn't a particularly vast ship, having been built as a Medicae center, but it was hundreds of meters long, and the warping of its corridors made it even bigger on the inside. To prevent his thoughts from wandering again as he advanced, Alaric stretched his perceptions, calling upon another gift of the changing god. That one had been given not because he would need it to accomplish his mission, but because, as far as Alaric could understand it, Zyonch had found it amusing to do so. Just like, during his final adventure on Elder, Alaric's thoughts had been plagued by the whispers of Gary and Drakencraft, so too here could he listen in on the unfettered now that he was aboard the same ship as the Fleshmaster. That gift hadn't worked on the surface, for it required that he be on the same planet as his prey. Now, however, he could finally listen. And it turned out that the unfettered, like many former apothecaries of the traitor legions given free license to exert their darkest imaginings, loved to talk. The process of ascension to demonhood is a slow and gradual one. I have heard of cases where a champion of the ruinous powers proved his worth with a single act of dedication and was immediately elevated, but I do not believe these to be more than wishful tales, or, at best, a handful of combinations of coincidences so improbable that my research doesn't need to bother with them. Something that had once had a name slithered on the ground. Alaric kicked it, breaking its misshapen head and pulping its brain. Tumorous grey matter spilled onto the floor, and the agent of Zyonch caught a glimpse of something looking at him in the pattern of gore. His master was keeping his infinite eyes on him, making sure Alaric played his part in this scheme. When one of the four decides, for whatever reason, to mold one of his followers into a demon prince, the warp will slowly erode their soul, hollowing it from the inside out, removing a little more of their spiritual essence with every fell deed they commit for their patron's glory. He crossed path with a tribe of mutants, huddling together in the dark, clutching crude weapons fashioned from bits of the ship that had fallen off. They stared at him with eyes that had gone blind generations ago, seeing the fire of his soul rather than the black armor or the sapphire flames. Alaric simply walked through the group, and they parted around him. None of them recognized him for the intruder he was. After so long surrounded by monsters, they simply thought him another of their world's predators, and were glad enough that he did not hurt them as the others did. These pieces of the champion's soul are gradually consumed by the Empyrean, transformed back into raw, chaotic soul stuff that still bears some traces of the original soul. This energy fills the emptiness in the champion's soul, increasing his power as he walks along the path to glory. He found himself in a looping corridor, endlessly repeating the same 100 meters of metal walls dripping with humidity. It took Alaric 19 loops before he managed to catch sight of the demon lurking within the walls, trapping mortals into the loop until they were weakened enough by exhaustion to feed on them. It then took Alaric 7 seconds to kill the creature and escape. Only through a tremendous effort of will can this energy be kept under control long enough to reach the saturation point, when the mortal soul is little more than a shell around a ball of warp energy in the vague shape of the entity it has slowly replaced. Cracking that shell is the process in which the last remnants of mortality are thrown away, and a new demon prince rises. He passed through a chamber that had once been an hydroponic garden, where fresh food had been grown for the ship's patients that required them. Now it was a forest straight out of an ancient fairy tale, full of gnarled trees and pale lights in the distance. Alaric let loose his fire, burning the entire forest to the ground before he left. He fancied that, amidst the sounds of wood burning, he could hear the relieved gasps of released souls. Is it truly the same being as the one it originated from? Who knows? I believe that there is continuity of consciousness, at least, for the process is gradual enough that the transition from mortal soul to demonic essence is not a clear-cut one. But in the end, does it really matter? Such concerns are for philosophers to spend years discussing, without ever arriving at a conclusion. Let the sons of Magnus waste their lives contemplating the answers, while I achieve the impossible. The door to the Unfettered's laboratory was unguarded, its only defense a warding circle on the threshold, keeping any never-born from crossing it. That struck Alaric as odd, but then he realized that, on this ship, the only creatures that would willingly come to the heart of horror would be the demons spawned in its depths. No ensouled creature would willingly put themselves close to such evil. None except the Unfettered himself, and Alaric, whose soul was still mortal, and thus immune to these wards. He passed through unopposed, and found himself in a vast chamber. Now, he could hear the Unfettered's voice without using the gift of Zeonch. Though imbued, those I once called the Ascended, blind as I was to their limitations, were my early attempt at replicating the process, by infusing mortal souls with the power of the warp. But while I had some success, I could not go far enough to reach the saturation point. All my subjects perished long before that, transforming into chaos spawns from the uncontrolled energies burning within them. Even those who seemed to have achieved balance could not reach true transcendence, for upon the death of their physical forms their souls dissolved into the ether, unable to hold on to their power. For a long time, I did not understand why that was. It was filled with machines strange and terrible, ancient technology from humanity's golden age mixed with newfangled creations of the dark mechanicum and the Unfettered's own mad genius. Lightning coils were crawling with tethered warp energy, redirecting it into the engines. Cell cultures were growing within chambers bathed in radiation and raw mutagenic energy. Flayed creatures, only a few of which were recognizable as having once been humans, hung from dissection tables or were locked into stasis fields. The members of the coven that Lord Arkan sent to assist me provided the key to finishing my work. Unfortunately, after that I had to send them back to their master. Their psychic minds wouldn't have been able to bear the echoes of what I must do to solve the problem. Ironic, that the only ones capable of bringing about humanity's apotheosis would be those who lack what is currently the closest equivalent. Perhaps that too was part of the god's design. All of these had been pushed to the edge of the room, freeing a vast space in its center where a ritual circle had been painted on the floor. More than 10 meters in diameter, it had been drawn in blood, the vitae of mortals, space marines and demons mixed together. At its center was a pile of human remains, decayed almost unto bones. Now, I believe that I have finally solved the riddle of eternity. All that remain is one last test, and then I shall know whether or not I am correct. If I am wrong, then I shall return to my research, starting from scratch once more. If I am right, well, that is when the real work shall begin. And there, standing at the edge of the circle, clad in power armor repainted black and gold, was the Unfettered. He turned to face Alaric as the reforged soul entered, and did not appear surprised. So, said the Unfettered. The gods have finally made their move. I expected you to arrive sooner. You know why I have come. You have abandoned your faith and betrayed the gods. How unexpected for one of your breed, remarked Alaric. How could I have faith in gods that I know are real? It is not faith to follow a creed out of fear of its author's wrath. It is not faith to obey the whims of unfathomable entities in exchange for the promise of special treatment in the afterlife. Faith is doing what is right, what you truly believe must be done. Faith is about truth, and when Horus fell and we fled into the warp, I learned the truth, said the Unfettered, standing tall and proud. I saw that the gods will not, cannot, grant humanity the ascension they promised. Because in the end, for all their divine power, they are the reflection of mankind's true nature. And humans are cowardly creatures, afraid to embrace their true potential. They will have to be dragged into the light, kicking and screaming, and remade into what they were always meant to be. And it will be my work that brings them here. You would defy the will of the gods, son of their anointed archpriest? I no longer bear the word of Lorga, spat the Fleshmaster. All of our fathers have failed. I am a forsaken son, and I will seek my own path under the banner of Arkin. I will take the gift of immortality from the Pantheon, and with it, I shall forge a legion of Ascended, who will bring down the corrupt Imperium and all those who refuse to cast off the shackles of their existence. You will do no such thing. You will die here, and your schemes will die with you. With your death, I will pay my debt to the changing God, and take from the awakened one as he took from my world. Your world? What do you? The eyes of the Unfettered widened in sudden understanding. I see. A spirit from the conquest of the Wailing Storm, reforged into a tool to stop me. Lorga was right on one thing at least, the gods truly have a cruel sense of humor. Then come, spirit, laughed the Fleshmaster, drawing his weapons in one fluid motion. Kill me if you can, but you will find me a stronger opponent than the vermin you have killed thus far. Faced at last with the warrior he had come to slay, Alaric opened himself to his precognitive sight. More than his ability to hide from sight, more than the black blades he could conjure out of nothing, more than the flames of chaos burning within him, it had been this gift from Zeonch that had allowed him to get this far. A torrent of images flowed through his mind's eye, and he fought for clarity, barely able to glimpse a few seconds ahead. He feinted to the left before striking right, leaping with two long black blades in hand, aiming them at the Unfettered's throat, only to be caught mid-leap by a descending chainsword that cut him in two. He threw a spire of obsidian at his foe, who parried it away with his weapon before firing with his bolter, a single shot that detonated within his helmet and obliterated him. He jumped right at the chainsword, taking it right through his core before reaching down with one hand and pulling himself free, passing over the Unfettered, turning into the air. And he landed on the metal floor, the armor that was all that was solid about him bent and broken. But on the Unfettered's cheek formed a single drop of blood, at the edges of the infinitesimal cut where Alaric's claw had touched the skin. Dozens, hundreds of possibilities, viewed in a fraction of a second, using all the advantages given to him by the God of Change, and this was the best he could do. But it was enough. The Fleshmaster turned to Alaric, raising a hand to his cheek, smiling at the sight of his would-be killer brought low, but he could not even complete that motion before falling face first to the ground, his armor clashing against the metal deck. He twitched, and his features contorted in agony for a second before the ability to withstand pain shared by all Space Marines asserted itself. From his position on the ground mere meters away, Alaric saw comprehension dawn in his victim's eyes. The Chaos Marine laughed weakly, blood spilling from his mouth. His body was breaking apart, the wrath of Zeonch destroying him from the inside. The gifts of chaos could most often be survived, especially by Space Marine biology, but the plague of change raging in the Unfettered's genes had been crafted to kill, not bless. Even the changer of ways sometimes needed to remove a piece from the board, rather than turn it to his side. You are nothing but a pawn of Zeonch, he wheezed. Do you think the changing god will reward you for your service? He will discard you the moment you stop to amuse him. I don't care, replied Alaric flatly. As long as I have my vengeance, I care naught for what fate befalls me. Your master has aligned himself with the Dark God's chosen, but like him, he struggles against his leash. He has already taken the first step to return to his rightful path, but still needs to be reminded of his true place in the great scheme of things. And I will take great pleasure in humbling him by bringing his plans for Achilles crashing down. His plans? Confusion momentarily replaced pained amusement on the Fleshmaster's face. Have Zionch's ministrations driven you mad? Archon gave me this world to do with it as I wished. My reward for helping make it turn to our side. He has no plans for it. It was Alaric's turn to laugh, as he forced himself to his feet, his armor cracking and groaning, his flames sputtering once, twice, before flaring once more. For once so learned in your dark hearts, you truly know nothing, son of Lorga. The Awakened One knows all that you have done here, and he counted on someone noticing what you were attempting and coming to stop it, but he didn't think it would be someone like me. Yet there is no need for you to know just how completely you have failed your lord as well as the gods. Die in ignorance. And yet, as the last of the Unfettered's blood spilled onto the ritual lines traced on the deck, the warrior who had sold his name in exchange for surviving the Horus heresy, who had defied the gods and sought to create a masterpiece out of unspeakable horror, was still smiling. His soul slipped from his body and into the Empyrean, where it remained nameless, safeguarded from the claws of the ruinous powers by the same namelessness that had protected him from Zionch's direct wrath and forced the god of lies to send his reforged pawn to dispose of him instead. His tale ended, his ultimate fate known only to the thing with which he had bargained on the battlefield of a burning world, at the height of the rebellion against the false emperor. Alaric turned his burning gaze away from the Astartes corpse and to the laboratory around him. His target was dead, but there was still the chance that another Fleshmaster would be able to use his research and finish his blasphemous work. That possibility flared in his precognitive mind, showing him the disaster that would follow if Archon gained the ability to transform his mortal followers into demon princes without the intervention of the dark gods. This could not be allowed, but just as Zionch had intended, all that he needed to do to ensure it never came to pass was destroy this ship and everyone on it, and for one such as he, there were plenty of means to do so. The machines in this room were crackling with warp energy, barely contained by dark mechanicum genius. And while it had taken generations of madmen and the work of decades to build them, any idiot could break them in the most catastrophic way possible, if he just knew where to hit. He began to move toward the nearest of these machines, but froze halfway to it, before slowly turning around and looking at the ritual circle that covered most of the floor. The runes were glowing where the blood of the Unfettered touched it, and that brilliance was spreading across the lines and unholy symbols, until the whole circle was ignited, shining with baleful light. And in the center of that circle, a hole in the fabric of the universe opened, and a figure stepped through. It was tall, so tall that it had to bend to fit in a space designed to accommodate an Astartes bulk. A pair of horns emerged from its temples, curling outward like a ram's. One of its shoulders was crowned by a spike of bone as thick as its arms, ending in a break that had clearly been the result of violence. Its face was a mismatch of scales and fur, with a mouth full of blocky, square teeth, and 4 eyes that glowed with greenish light. It wore a cloak of absolute blackness that still could not hide the bulges and deformities of the body beneath. The 2 hands that emerged from the sleeves each had 2 long fingers that each bore half a dozen rings and ended in 2-sided claws that would have made putting the rings on impossible if this had been a creature of the materium. But it was no such thing. It was an entity of the Empyrean, materialized into the mortal universe through an effort of will and sorcery. Though he had never seen that creature before, Alaric recognized the shape of the soul fire that burned within it, cloaking its essence with shaped warp matter. Garion, the god-forged soul, sneered at the immense figure. Alaric, replied the creature. With surprising gentleness, Garion turned the Unfettered's body on his back, before closing his eyes and crossing his arms on his chest. So, you are his creation. You are the one soul with which he succeeded in his heretical ambitions. I am, said the usurper of immortality. Or so it seems. We weren't certain, not until he broke my neck and my spirit fell into the Empyrean, waiting for him to call me back. Did you know that a demon's killer can summon them back into the materium, without needing to wait for the banishment period to be over? It was one of the truths I learned during my experiments on Elder. No one else had ever tried summoning a demon they had personally defeated. You are a monstrosity. A blasphemy against the gods. Your punishment for this will be legendary, Garion. When the gods get their hands on you, they will tear you apart. Do you think so? And yet, when I was in their realm moments ago, they did nothing. I saw them, the 4 sitting on their thrones, and all they did was watch. I think they were scared. Scared of what the Unfettered had accomplished. Scared that others may discover what he has, in time. You have killed him, but I endure. And eventually, all those who are worthy shall share in my glory. Look upon me, Alaric." Garion was roaring now, his voice causing the walls and ceiling to shake. "I have accomplished that which I could only dream of, as I looked into the ether from my castle's tower. This is apotheosis. I am a god." And then, faced with this abominable demon prince, his soul fire leaking from the cracks in his black armor, Alaric finally understood the final scheme of Xianche for him. He saw the many reasons for his reforging, the countless goals and purposes behind his sending to Achilles. For one perfect, terrible moment, he witnessed the full scope of Xianche's plan for him, from his life on Elder to this instant, aboard the Truthful Gate, surrounded by forbidden devices and facing a foe he could not hope to defeat, even though he had spent years of his life trying to kill him, back when they had both been mere mortal men, born of the same world trapped in the wailing storm. He laughed, and prepared to die for the second, and hopefully final, time. Azarok Sector, Beranos System. 744.M32. The church was, by imperial standard, quite small. Its rows of pews could barely sit a couple hundred people, and its support pillars rose less than 100 meters high. But it was clear that it had seen a lot of visitors over the years, and that it had been well maintained during that time. Thousands of small candles burned in alcoves surrounding votive offerings, and every pillar had been carved into the image of a space marine, clad in full battle armor, bearing the weight of the church just as the living angels of death bore the weight of the Imperium on their shoulders. For generations, these giants of stone had looked down upon the faithful who came here to worship. Each was subtly different from the rest, though whether they represented actual space marine heroes or were simply the fruit of the sculptor's imagination was unknown. That was a sign of the church's age, for the ecclesiarchy was usually meticulous about such things. At the end of the church, under a huge statue of the god emperor with his arms opened wide and protected behind a thick panel of plexiglass, was the reason for the church's prosperity. A huge rectangular oil painting, 4 meters high and 10 meters wide, showing the Primarch Robute Guliman in his full battle gear, with the emblem of the 500 worlds on his chest and the gauntlets of Ultramar around his hands. He stood atop a rocky hill, looking in the distance, his expression unreadable, as if contemplating matters beyond the ken of mortal men. The landscape behind the Primarch was a sandy desert, illuminated by a crimson sun, with strange rock formations casting their shadow upon the sand. Vehicles, also painted in the blue of the ultramarines, could be seen threading the desert, advancing in the direction of the Primarch's gaze. It was a wondrous painting, made even more impressive by its history. It had been made during the Great Crusade, hundreds of years ago, by one of the remembrancers attached to the 13th Legion. That painter, Vincent Digios, had been born blind, yet the beauty of his paintings had attracted the eye of the remembrancer's recruiters, leading to him receiving specially designed cybernetic implants that had allowed him to receive images directly into his brain. With these implants, he had been able to combine hundreds of picts of the avenging sun with the tales of ultramarines who had seen the scene with their own eyes in order to create that painting. Digio's work had been highly valued by the imperial elite, but the master painter had disappeared during the Horus Heresy, his loss later attributed to the betrayal of the word-bearers at Calth, where fragmented records showed he had been transferred to cover what was supposed to be the Great Joint Campaign that would mend the rift between the 13th and 17th Legions. It was highly unlikely that a blind remembrancer could have survived the most bitter confrontation that took place there, though stranger things had happened during the Battle of Calth. Regardless of the artist's fate, his work had already been spread across the galaxy, serving as an exemplar of what the remembrancers could achieve. Those who saw his work caught a glimpse of the glory of the Great Crusade, and after the heresy was put down, the images of the God Emperor's loyal sons became even more precious. The painting had belonged to one of Beranos' most influential family, who had gifted it to the nascent ecclesiarchy when the youngest son of that bloodline had convinced his father to convert to the imperial creed. At the time, the Church of the Emperor had not possessed the enormous resources it now had at its disposal, and this smaller temple had been all they had been able to build, the first imperial church of Beranos, and at its heart, the icon of Robute Guliman, most loyal son of the master of mankind. Every day for more than 15 centuries, hundreds of pilgrims had visited the chapel in order to see this painting with their own eyes. They had passed through the gates and sat upon the benches, staring at the painting's magnificence for a length of time dependent on the strength of their faith, that is to say, on the amount of the donation they had made to the ecclesiarchy. From dawn to dusk they had poured in, until the sun set, and the priests who served as the small church's caretakers forced everyone out, that they may clean and replace the incense braziers and the candles for the next day. These men saw little of the wealth that the pilgrims brought to the imperial creed. Theirs was a life of endlessly repeated duties and quiet contemplation. The stones of the church's floor had been eroded by the threading of countless feet, yet now, only one soul lurked within its walls. A warrior stood before the painting, taller than any mortal man, his face a near-perfect copy of the painting's august subject. Only a careful examination would have revealed that the warrior was perhaps a touch younger than the painted Primarch, though his eyes were very, very old. The other difference was much more obvious. While the painting showed Guilliman with short blonde hair, this warrior's was white. "We were made in your image," said the warrior softly, his words carried across the church by the architecture's acoustics. "Just as you were made in his. That is what we were told, when we were taken as children and transformed into living weapons." The Astartes raised a gauntleted hand and pressed it against the glass. Ordinarily, this would have triggered all manners of alarms, but those had been deactivated prior to the warrior's arrival. At the same time the priests had been evacuated. "We fought to build this empire," continued the Jean son of Guilliman. "We killed, bled and died for it, for its people. And so did you. You fought through loss and betrayal, and in the end, you fell. Did you regret anything when Fulgrim's blade cut your throat, or were you relieved that you would no longer have to watch as the Imperium slowly turned away from your ideals?" The painted Primarch did not answer the warrior's question, of course. But he continued to speak, talking to the empty church as if it could grant him some kind of revelation. "What would you think of the Empire now? What would you think of this place, where your image is enshrined, and worshipped by generations of slaves who know nothing of freedom? You, who fought and died to keep mankind free." Suddenly, he slammed his fist through the glass and punched a hole through the centuries-old masterpiece, tearing the fabric apart and ripping the image of Roboute Guilliman's armor. The damage spread through the antique painting, and it crumbled behind the panel of glass, turning to priceless dust before the warrior's eyes as time finally caught up with it. He watched the destruction of history, and told himself that he felt nothing but hatred and contempt. "It doesn't matter," growled the warrior, and his face, full of bitterness and fury, no longer resembled that of the avenging son at all. His words were thick with anger as he ground his fist against the wall through the deteriorating remnants of the painting he had so casually ruined beyond all hope of repair. "You were a blind fool, and now you are dead, and the Imperium will soon follow suit. And I will play my part in its destruction, no matter that your blood flows through my veins. I won't be a victim of fate like you were. I will forge my path in the blood of those who oppose me. I am unbound." Malone, the Lord of the Unbound, chosen of Akan and warlord of the Unbound host, pulled his fist free from the broken glass, and turned his back on the defaced painting of the Primarch whose gene seed had reforged his body. He took his helmet from where he had left it on the altar and placed it upon his head, covering his face with the horned piece of gear. He only ever took the helm off when he was alone, lest someone see his face and recognize the similarity with that of the Primarch whose gene seed had been used to turn him into one of the Unbound, what felt like an eternity ago. The rumors that this habit had spawned among his warband were preferable to the truth. Better for the other Unbound to think him a hideous mutated freak than having to deal with the potential revolt the revelation of his heritage could cause. Like the rest of his armor, the helm was painted in black and gold, and was the work of the best heretics available to the Forsaken Sons, as befitting of one of Arkan's chosen. A sword and pistol hung from his waist, each a prize he had taken during the conquest of the Wailing Storm and which had been refitted by the tech priests of the Dark Mechanicum to fit his transhuman hands. He slammed the wooden doors of the church open as he left, tearing them off their hinges with the strength of his blow. Several dozen soldiers were standing at attention outside the church, holding its 10 caretakers prisoners. The men could have escaped before the Forsaken Sons' forces' arrival, but they had stubbornly remained, choosing death rather than abandoning the duty they had inherited from their predecessors. There had been 5 more, who had tried to fight, and had been killed before the rest had been captured. They had been beaten, badly, yet they still glared at him. There was courage, even honor in such devotion, Malone had to admit, but both were misguided. The God Emperor they worshipped was a lie, and the Primarch whose icon they had prayed to had been dead for centuries, slain by a champion of the galaxy's true gods. Neither of them could do anything to protect those who prayed to them, and mankind could not afford such weakness if it was to survive in the galaxy. Faith, he had learned, was a potent force, and it should not be wasted on false gods, not when there were others who could reward it in abundance. The Lord of the Unbound stared at the men, and they looked back at him, their eyes filled with defiance despite the terror every single one of them was feeling. They had been handled quite roughly by the soldiers, there was blood on more than one of their ecclesiastic vestments. Malone could smell their fear, thick in the pollution-laden air of Barano's capital city, and yet they did not beg. Slowly, he walked toward them, and though their fear increased with each step he took as his transhuman presence washed over them, they still did not lower their gazes. There were many like them on Baranos. The planet had fallen to the Unbound host, but there were still thousands who resisted the rule of the Forsaken Sons. Examples had to be made to keep the millions of civilians covering in fear within their crumbling cities from joining the resistance, and over the last few months, Malone had had the opportunity for plenty such lessons. "Burn it," he said to the soldiers. One of them, a true follower of the ruinous powers, judging by the self-inflicted scars on his face, started to protest, mentioning how they could desecrate the church rather than simply destroy it and thus earn the god's favor. Malone slapped the mortal, breaking his neck with the merest use of his transhuman strength, before snarling at the rest, his helmet picking up on his anger through his armor, which had fused with his body several years ago, and filtering his voice to remove its last traces of humanity. "Burn it." "Yes, my lord," immediately answered one of the dead man's comrades, before taking charge of the soldiers not directly handling the prisoners and directing them to the task at hand. Under her lead, the soldiers spilled several barrels of promethium outside and inside the church, before withdrawing to a safe distance and letting the tanks they had come to the area in open fire. Within seconds, the ruins of the church were ablaze, the flames leaping high as they devoured every trace of a place of devotion more than 1,000 years old. The priests wept and screamed at the sight, struggling against their captors, but the soldiers were far stronger than them, and kept them on their knees. Malone watched the horror and despair on their faces, his back turned to the fire. Even through his armor, he could feel its heat. Before he had become unbound, in the land of the dark where he had been born, he would never have thought such flames could exist. Fire had been a rarity, something precious. Fuel had been scarce, used with parsimony to keep warm during the coldest times and as a defense against the monsters that dwelled in the blackest corners. Now, he barely acknowledged the inferno at all. Their task accomplished, the soldiers retreated from the burning church. The woman who had taken command after Malone had killed the one who had tried to protest stood closest to him, far enough not to show disrespect, but close enough that it was clear she was waiting for further orders. "You are one of the Androcasian recruits, aren't you?" said the Unbound, his gaze still fixed on the kneeling priests. "I recognize your uniform." That was true, but it wasn't the full truth. There was something else that marked her as one from that world, the way she moved, the instinctual obedience to authority that needed to be displayed at all times. Only those born on that twisted garrison world, having lived under the constant threat of being executed for perceived disloyalty to their demented supreme leader, had that kind of gait. "Yes, Lord Malone," she replied. "I served with Governor Nye when she was still a general." He nodded. "You took part in the operation to overthrow Malarios?" "I was in one of the strike forces that kept reinforcements from interfering with the tyrant's death, yes," she said, the faintest hint of satisfaction creeping into her voice. Malone nodded again, solely to himself this time. It had been a long time since the Unbound host had freed the garrison world of Androkas Prime from its governor, a Slayer-Ineshi demon hiding within the corpse of the previous incumbent, who had ruled the world using sorcerous drugs to keep the population from going mad and compliant to its whims. During that time, the forces they had been rewarded with, professional soldiers all, a cut above most of the mortal troops gathered for the Black Crusade, had gone through a lot of changes. Some, like the one he had killed, has completely embraced the worship of the ruinous powers, becoming more akin to cultists than true soldiers. Others had gone mad when confronted with the true nature of the allies to which they had been attached, and had killed themselves or rebelled and had to be put down. And some, like this woman, had turned their loyalty to the Forsaken Sons, retaining their professionalism while accepting the inevitable changes that service under Chaos Marines brought to any armed force. Over several years of waging war in the Wailing Storm, Malone had learned that the latter category was the most useful one. "What is your name, soldier?" "Privately Zonderati, my lord," replied the woman, saluting by reflex as she identified herself. Malone glanced down at the corpse at his feet, noting the dead man's rank insignia, still visible under the defiled uniform. "Not anymore," he said. "Consider yourself promoted, Lieutenant Ariati. Finish cleaning up here, then bring your squad to headquarters. I will have work for you." "Thanks you, my lord. I won't disappoint you." "I know you won't. After all, you know the penalty for that, don't you?" As he walked toward his transport, the newly promoted lieutenant called out to him, "What do you want us to do with the prisoners, my lord?" Under his helm, Malone smiled. He had almost forgotten about that. The Beranos system had been the last of the Azeroth sector's stars to fall to the Unbound host. The single inhabited world in the system had been a difficult fight, both because of its greater defenses and because the host's orders had been to take it with as little damage as possible in order to turn those defenses against the Imperium. The system was on the single warp route between the Azeroth and Econta sectors, and holding it would effectively block the Imperium from interfering with the Awakened One's plans within Azeroth. "We aren't exactly suited to defensive battles," thought Malone ruefully, looking down at the land that fled away as his gunship flew. "But we were the only ones who could make it here in time." It was true. When the separate warbands of the Forsaken Sons had come together once more under Arkan's banner at the end of the conquest of the Wailing Storm, their ranks had been very varied. Each group had found new and strange allies, slaves and weapons within the warp-shrouded sector. The Unbound host wasn't the most numerous army to answer the Awakened One's call, but by the whims of the gods, the holds of their ships contained a veritable arsenal of weapons capable of killing entire worlds. That grim collection had begun with the nuclear bombs found on Androka's Prime, and had significantly increased since. That was why Arkan had sent the Unbound host to Beranos. After the defeat of the Imperial forces at Silberstadt, it had been crucial to seize the frontier system as quickly as possible in order to prevent reinforcements from rejoining the various battlefields of the Black Crusade. But though the bulk of the Imperial Armada had been destroyed at Silberstadt, there were still millions of soldiers scattered across the sector able to take up arms against the Forsaken Sons. The path to Beranos was guarded by 6 systems, each of which needed to be crushed in order to prevent the troops who would eventually hold Beranos from being attacked on that front as well. And so Malone had been given the order to deploy the planet-killing weapons at his disposal to hasten the arrival of the Unbound host to Beranos. In the months since the Forsaken Sons had split apart once more, he had directly ordered the death of tens of billions, more lives than his forces had taken in years of campaigning inside the Wailing Storms, where the goal had been conquest, not ruin. Worlds had burned, and worse, because of him, so that he could fulfill his part of Arkan's grand plan. 5 entire star systems, utterly destroyed. Every passage through the warp on that journey had been harder than the previous one, as the slaughter they left in their wake roused the Neverborn into a feeding frenzy. Things had gotten so bad that, in order to even make sure they reached Beranos rather than be destroyed mid-translation, Malone had to improvise at the last system before this one. They had made a sacrifice of the system, adapting a trick that the Night Haunter had used during the Great Crusade and amplifying its effects with sorcery and demonic rituals. For an entire night, corpses had rained upon the cities of Loktos, causing the utter collapse of public order as horrified madness grasped the entire population. And while the slaves of the false emperor had been tearing each other apart in the street, strike teams of Unbound had sabotaged the plasma reactors of the hives. The resulting coordinated detonations had sent billions of screaming, blood-tainted souls into the warp, all of them dedicated to the dark gods through sacrifice and ritual. The Unbound host had left Loktos a poisoned wasteland, haunted by ghosts and monsters chewing on the world's bones. But the final step of the journey to Beranos had been both easy and quickened by this offering. And Malone had felt nothing, save the cold satisfaction of performing his duty, the function for which he had been made. This, too, was what the Lord of the Unbound told himself. The polluted air of Beranos roared around the gunship as it brought Malone back to the Unbound host's stronghold. Even through the filters of his helm, the Chaos Lord could smell the chemicals in the atmosphere, as well as the fainter hints of fire and blood. Though the last significant resistance had been crushed days ago, parts of the cities were still burning. Things roamed the flames, drawn to the material by the spilling of blood. He saw the ruins of the governor's estates as they flew over them. During the invasion, One of the Unbound had suggested using the palace that had stood there as headquarters. Clearly the Fleshmaster who had transformed him hadn't searched for intelligence among his subjects. There were hundreds like him, harvested from the worlds of the Wailing Storm where relatively clean genetics remained within the human population. These new Unbound were untested in a true war like the Paraxis campaign, but they were veterans of raids and slaughter alike. Most of them, however, had little in the way of tactical insight, which this particular specimen had proven. Malone had shaken his head sadly, beaten the fool halfway to death with his armored fists and proceeded to calmly explain to the moron's twitching form just how stupid his proposition was. While the palace had boasted some impressive-looking defenses, these had been built to repel rebellious mobs, not transhuman strike teams, as demonstrated by these with which the Unbound had taken the place. There was a subtlety in imperial architecture that was lost on most of its enemies as well as its denizens. A governor's palace was meant to impress the might and majesty of the Imperium upon the populace and enforce the rule of terror, while also making sure that, should the governor get ideas above his station, the Imperium would easily be able to crush him. Sure, if an army sought to occupy a planet and turn its population, then control of the centers of power was important, but the purpose of the Unbound host was not to control Beranos, merely to hold it. Instead, they had killed everyone in the governor's palace, plundered everything of value, and set fire to it. Malone himself had cut down the old, terrified man who had once held absolute authority over the system, and made sure images of the kill were broadcast across the planet, along with the last, begging words of the fool. Then, at Malone's command, the Dark Mechanicum had turned one of the planet's mountains into a fortress. It had taken them weeks, and there were still servitors at work in the least important sections. But the fortress was functional, and was held by tens of thousands of troops, along with an array of defenses that would give any army pause. It was surrounded by a ring of several dozens lesser outposts, with overlapping lines of fire and a total army that, last time they had counted, reached just over the million. As for the idiotic Unbound he had beaten, last Malone had heard, he had recovered, and was serving aboard one of the ships hanging in orbit of Beranos, along with the rest of his pack. Hopefully the idiot had learned a lesson or two from the experience, and wouldn't seek revenge. The gunship touched down on one of the landing pads carved on the mountainside, and Malone exited the transport, leaving it into the care of a crew of servitors and their heretic overseers. One of the advantages of ranks was that he didn't need to care for the gunship, as long as he wanted transport anywhere in the theater of operation, his minions would provide it. He walked through the labyrinthine fortress, following the path displayed on his helmet's display. Everywhere he went, menials bowed in supplication, whispering his praises in trembling voices. They all knew him, they knew that he held their lives in his hands, and through those who followed him, their souls as well. He ignored them all, they were only mortals, and there were very few of those he found worthy of his attention. After today, he might have found another in Lizond, but that was still to be decided. The command center had been installed deep within the mountain, rather than at its top, and was entirely sealed, without any window showing the outside. Instead, the walls were covered with picked screens showing the surrounding areas as well as cascades of data. A massive hololithic projector, currently inactive, occupied the center of the room, and thick cables ran from it and toward other rooms of the stronghold. Power, data and other, less wholesome things coursed through these cables. In a way, the command center was brain of the fortress. Of course, given the Unbound's propensity for ignoring orders in favor of pursuing battle, if Malone had used his kindred to man the fortress, it would have been the brain of an epileptic child with anger management issues and a short attention span. Which was why only a handful of the few reliable packs were permanent defenders, along with a great many more mortal soldiers. The rest of the Unbound would play a different part in Malone's strategy to hold Beranos. Two figures towered above the heretics and the staff. Both were clad in power armor, and both were armed. One of them was Malone's brother, the other, the one who had made him what he was. He would never call him father, though, that name belonged to a man who had died long ago, in the dark. Not to Robute Gulaman, and not to the Fleshmaster Jacaerus. "You were almost late," noted Igdal with a frown. "Are you done with your errand, brother?" Malone merely nodded in response, and Igdal let it go. Both he and Jacaerus knew Malone's secret, but there were many mortals in the room. Still, he had heard the unspoken reproach in his brother's voice. As one of the chosen, he had many responsibilities he couldn't simply abandon. Destroying the painting and the church had been, he had to admit, an indulgence, perhaps even a foolish one, regardless of how in character it may have been. Imagery of Roboute Guilliman wasn't exactly rare in the Imperium, and nearly every legionary who fought under Archon's banner knew the face of the Avenging Sun. The only exceptions were those who had been inducted into their respective legions during the course of the rebellion, the first generation of Astartes who had known nothing but war with their own kind, and for whom the Great Crusade was only a story. So removing the church and its contents had done little to help keep Malone's secret. But it had been cathartic, and after the mad rush to get to Beranos ahead of the Imperium, the Lord of the Unbound had felt the need to vent. It wasn't as if anyone would question his desire to destroy a temple to the 13th Primarch, after all. Such symbolic gestures were expected from those who walked the path to glory, and as one of Archon's chosen, it was clear to all that Malone had the eyes of the gods turned upon him. There had been plenty of attempts by the more zealous of the host to convert him to the worship of only one of the powers, but he had resisted so far. "Then we can begin," said Jacaerus, gesturing to the circular hololith at the center of the command center. "I will call the others." Less than an hour later, 8 figures stood around the circular table. Each of these beings held great power on his own, yet all were under the command of Malone, first among equals by the will of the Awakened One, who none within the Wailing Storm dared defy. The Lord of the Unbound stood at the command panel of the hololith projector, with Igdal at his right. Jacaerus stood next counterclockwise, the Flesh Master watching the proceedings with reptilian eyes from within his helmet. He removed it as frequently than Malone, though for different reasons. Karkios, once of the 4th Legion, had been the first after the 3 of them to arrive. As the stronghold's castellant, he had had the shortest distance to travel. He had been checking the reactors buried deep within the mountain, behind defenses thrice as powerful as those around the command center itself, for the fortress could survive the loss of its brain, but if the reactors were compromised, everyone on the continent would feel the explosion. Karkios was one of the few legionaries attached to the Unbound host. He and his pack, all of them sons of Perturabo, had a reputation among the Forsaken Sons. It had been them who had gone to the demon world of Mulatertius, not long after the Wailing Storm had been unleashed, and helped Archon arrange the deal between the Warband and the infernal spirit that ruled the Dark Forged world. It had been Karkios who had built the Hindsight's Mind, the tactical simulator that the Awakened One had used to help him plan every conquest, including the Black Crusade itself. The legionary had also been in charge of the Unbound during the Paraxis campaign, and knew their tempers all too well. He and his 5 battle brothers had been attached to the Unbound host at the Warband's gathering, to help manage the resupply of the host. Malone had seen the former Iron Warrior feed millions of souls to the demon at the heart of C-2746-SS 885, as the Mechonicus had called Mulatertius before its fall, in exchange for the ammunition, fuel and weapons that had fed the Black Crusade's hungry engines of war. These sacrifices had been harvested from across the Wailing Storm, civilians from cities with no industry worth preserving them for. Under his armor, Karkios was more machine than flesh, having systematically amputated every mutation inflicted upon him by the whims of the warp. Even his vocal cords were gone, replaced by a gritty, synthetic voice. Whenever he spoke, his words came out as a reconstructed simulation of his old voice, made of recordings pulled from his armor's databanks. After all the years Karkios had served, there was plenty of material for it to use, though it did make almost any inflection and tone impossible to emulate faithfully. Iams had been next to arrive, taking his place at Malone's left. The young Unbound had changed a great deal since the gene seed of Magnus the Red had been implanted into his body. Using his psychic powers in the Wailing Storm, with little training or experience, had altered him in ways both subtle and obvious. Malone knew that Iam's sense of touch was all but completely deadened. He could no longer feel pain, but his perception of the warp had been sharpened in exchange. As a result of this enhanced connection to the Sea of Souls, Iam's very presence radiated power, a dark aura that terrified mere mortals and could drive other psychers catatonic with dread. While that had been useful in a few situations, it did make Iam's everyday life on the Blade of Terror more difficult, as he couldn't go anywhere sensitive on the ship lest someone important faint in terror. Finally, and most obvious of the sorcerer's gifts, his left arm had been transformed into a tentacle that hung from the shoulder socket of his armor, which had been modified appropriately after the mutation had manifested itself. The bluish limb had sprouted from Iam's torso after his original arm had been severed at the shoulder in an especially difficult conquest. It had grown overnight, before the heretics had time to build an augmetic replacement or vat-grow a cloned one. It looked more like a lizard's tail than an octopus limb, and its scales formed abstract patterns significant to the changing god. Iams had tried to cut it off after it had first appeared, but it had started growing back immediately, and the Flesh Masters weren't sure they could amputate it and replace it with an augmetic safely. Even they weren't too keen on meddling with a gift from the dark gods, however unwanted it may have been. Eventually, Iams had grown used to his new limb, though it had forced him to change his approach to battle. He no longer used a pistol, simply holding a dagger in his hand while blasting his enemies with psychic attacks at range. The dagger had been used in many rituals, and when Iams wasn't using it, it was kept contained within a warded sheath lest the energies lingering on the blade affect those nearby. Malone knew that, when the Forsaken Sons had gathered at the dawn of the Black Crusade, Iams had gone to see Arsim, the sorcerer lord who led the coven. The Sorcerer of Blood had formally inducted the Unbound Psyker into the ranks of the Coven, and Malone suspected that a bargain of some kind had taken place before Iams had returned from the meeting. A mortal man had been the next to arrive, clad in unadorned crimson robes, every inch of his skin covered in scar tissue. He carried no obvious weapons, yet there was a quiet confidence in his every motion that made others pay attention. He was Marcus, the Riven, speaker for the lost and the damned, and one of the few mortals that Malone respected. The Unbound Host, which had left the war for Paraxis composed almost entirely of the young Astartes, had accumulated a horde of mortal followers, slaves, if one was honest about such things. Entire armies, who had either joined willingly, or been forced to kneel under threat of obliteration. Some were well-trained soldiers on the same level as Astra Militarum shock troops, while others were hordes of barbarians armed with iron blades and drugged out of their minds. And from the tithed armies of Androkas Prime to the slaughter dogs of the 7 princes of Udagesh, Marcus spoke for them all at Malone's council. The Riven had been found on a world of flying stones and black, churning oceans, the last survivor of a community beset by the beasts that dwelled in the watery depths. The Unbound had tracked the echoes of a distress signal sent by the city in whose ruins he had dwelled, and after the first Rakan squad had gone mysteriously silent, Malone had gone in himself, with Igdal as his sole escort. The two of them had found Marcus, and after a tense discussion, they had convinced him to join them. It had not taken long for the Riven to rise through the ranks. His presence commanded respect, and he was very good at what he did. He was an incredible diplomat, capable of bringing sworn enemies to make peace with one another, if only in fear of him. Those who opposed him, or tried to mount their own factions and coups among the mortal armies, were found dead, torn to pieces alongside with their inner circles. If Malone hadn't had Iams check Marcus out, he would have thought the man was some kind of demon in disguise, but he was indeed human, just an extremely lethal one. Malone had used Marcus as a herald during the conquest of the Wailing Storm, and he had brought entire nations to heel with only his words and the intimidating pressure that he emanated at all times. The mortal armies of the Unbound Host distrusted and sometimes outright hated each other, but they all feared and respected him, which was why none had protested Malone's decision to make him their representative on his war council. The last 2 members of the council, who had come only once they had been informed everyone else was already there, were not present in person. Morkoth, the Unbound who had suggested and orchestrated Lopta's doom, having known of the Night Lord's methods through the memories implanted in his mind during his ascension, was there in hollow only. He was the fleet master of the Unbound Host, and was aboard the Blade of Terror. With Imperial retribution on the way to Beranos, he could not afford to leave his post, even for a moment. And Alzerak, the representative of the Dark Mechanicum contingent attached to the host, was present through a servitor he, or she, or it, Malone wasn't sure, was possessing remotely. The Dark Marcus' true body was still aboard the Forge barge Eidolon of Regret, which wasn't what the Dark Mechanicum called their enormous flagship when they were among themselves, but was the name they had given to the Forsaken Sons. The servitor Alzerak was using as a mouthpiece was fused to the metallic chair on which it had been rolled in the room. "Let us begin," said Igdal, calling the gathering of the War Council to order. A data slate laid before him, listing all the matters that needed to be addressed. It was known by everyone here that while Malone may be the chosen of Arkan, it was Igdal who handled all the tedious details of actually running an army as vast as the Unbound Host. In a way, Their partnership was an extension of the association that had allowed them to survive in the dark, and later among the unbound. Malone was the visionary, the intuitive genius whose mind could grasp patterns far greater than himself, both on the fields of war and while fighting himself, and Igdal was the cold, analytical mind that considered every option carefully, reining him in when necessary. The main hololith flickered to life, showing a slowly rotating image of Beranos. At a command from Igdal, a region of the map started to glow red, data screeds rolling around it to describe its nature, a vast, empty plain, with a few outposts of civilization scattered across it wherever there were valuable resources to exploit. A particular point of that area was highlighted, a former mining operation that had been transformed into an improvised fortress for some of the few servants of the false emperor left on Beranos. The Unbound turned his gaze upon the Riven. You were given the task of dealing with this last week, Marcus. What is your report? The last remnants of the PDF have been crushed, said Marcus in his calm, soft voice. The Knights of Beribbon are celebrating their victory according to their rites, and have invited the cerulean companies to join the feasting. Against their better judgment, the captains have accepted the offer. The pits are dug and the fires have started. It will take them a day or two to go through all the bodies, and a few more after that to wake from their torpor and return to their post. Can they be brought back more quickly if needed? Asked Igdal. Marcus inclined his head, considering the question, weighing what he knew of the knights' devotion to their cannibalistic rituals balanced against the strength of his influence over them. It was a grim calculation, and a mistake may result in the loss of at least 2 of the armies under his command. His ability to make such judgments was another of the reasons for his exalted rank. Yes, he said after a few seconds, if they are recalled in the next few hours. After that, nothing short of a direct attack on them will get them to stop feasting, and even then, I wouldn't bet on it. Good enough, sighed Igdal. Morkoth, what's the status of the fleet? The repairs have been made and the last of our wounded brothers are out of the Fleshmaster's hands, said Morkoth. His voice was laden with static, yet the cold cruelty in every word was unmistakable. Our special preparations are also complete. The fleet is ready, brother. Very well. Karkios, Alzerak, is the stronghold ready for battle? There are still a few secondary armories and storerooms that need completion, but those are all for backup purposes. This fortress is as good as it's going to get from a defensive perspective, and I have to admit that I have rarely seen such good work in such short time. As for the secondary strongholds, Karkios shrugged, gesturing to the dark Marcus meat and iron puppet. We have had delays on several of our construction sites, said the avatar of Alzerak. The workforce you provided us with is dying faster than our predicting models had accounted for. We have updated our algorithms, and now estimate that it will take a further 14 days to complete the work per the specifications required. Get it done in 3, commanded Malone, speaking for the first time since the meeting had begun. We don't know when the Imperials will arrive, and I don't want us to face them with holes in our walls before the first shot is even fired. We do not have enough manpower. Turn those slaves we gave you into servitors, the Lord of the Unbound cut in. Bring them aboard the Eidolon, or get more of your people down there, and make them into cyborgs. They will work harder, better and longer, and I know you have the resources and the facilities to process them. These resources are meant to be used later in the campaign, protested the heretic. If he felt any shock at the sudden revelation of the depths of Malone's knowledge of the Eidolon of Regret's capabilities, the deadened face of his avatar showed no sign of it. The awakened one himself approved of our timetable. If Beranos falls because you weren't willing to spend your precious tech, asked Malone, his voice as cold as the void, what do you think Arkan will do to you? Very well, Lord Malone, the heretic gave in. It will be done. Good, was all Malone replied before turning back to the hololith. There is one last thing to address, said Igdal, drawing the attention away from the finished confrontation and turning his gaze to Iams. What news from the Black Temple, brother? Jerib's work continues, replied the sorcerer. Prisoners are dragged in chains to the altars from all across the ruined cities of this world. I can feel it, even from here, on the other side of this wretched ball of dirt. The rituals, they haven't stopped since Jerib's monsters set the last stone in place. I still don't trust that creature, grunted Karkios. We have invested too much in that scheme it proposed. Weapons, material, slaves, witches, are we certain it isn't playing us for fools? siphoning away our resources for its own ends while promising us what we desperately need? "I-ams," said Malone. Out of all of them, the Psyker was the one who knew the full steam and best, not because they were close, gods no, but because his powers gave him a unique insight into the nature of the abomination that the Unfettered had created and left them to deal with after he left. "The warp churns with the screams and the flames," murmured I-ams, his eyes suddenly fixed on something far, far away. "The corridors of the Black Temple echo with the cries of the damned, their pain bouncing off the wards, a pressure that builds up and up, denied release. No, son of the Lord of Iron. We cannot trust it, but Jerib did not lie to us, not in this at least." There was a moment of uncomfortable silence, as all present considered the Psyker's words. No one at the table trusted Jerib. There was something about the creature that made everyone wary of it, even warriors who had gone into battle with demons fighting alongside them and who had brothers turned into secondborn by the whims of the warp and the gifts of the gods. Jerib had grown strong in the Wailing Storm, and now led its own contingent of demon hosts, wids and other abominations. All of them were in the newly built Black Temple, and the rest of the unbound host was glad of the distance that put between them and that carnival of monstrous horrors. Even so, Kakyo's doubts were far from being his alone. But I-ams, well, most were aware of I-am's power, for he too had grown strong. But he was a sorcerer, and while none who were not members of the Coven truly understood what that meant, sorcerers were something the forces of chaos were used to. Jerib wasn't. Whatever it was that the Unfettered had made the man named Jerib into, Malone was quite certain there had never been anything like it before. "They are here," said I-ams suddenly. Seconds after he had spoken, alarms began to ring. "Report." Igdal barked to the mortal crew of the command room. "Warp breach detected at the system's edge," shouted one of the menials, his eyes long since replaced by thick cables connected to the cogitators, enabling him to stream data directly into his mind. "It's a massive one, sir." Fleet-sized, at least. Had he been mortal, Malone would have felt fear, terror, even, at the prospect of facing the Imperium's wrath. The armies of the unbound host only had the courage to stand against the fury of the Corpse Emperor's slaves because they feared their masters even more, or had been driven beyond fear by the madness of chaos. Any sane being would have been afraid of the might of the galaxy's greatest empire, for all that it was a pale shadow of its former glory. But he was unbound, and all he felt was anticipation. "Alzarak, cancel my previous order," he said out loud, his voice echoing across the room over the din of alarms, his will imposing order before anarchy could take hold. "Morkoth, send the signal to the unkindness, and tell the crew of the Shiva's Wrath to begin their preparations immediately. We will need them to open fire as soon as possible." A chorus of agreement met his commands, and the warlords of the unbound host set about doing the bidding of Archon's chosen. Malone himself remained where he was, staring at the hololith, which was now displaying the increasing number of Imperial ships breaking free from the warp at the system's edge. There were a great many of them, too many, he knew. But in the end, if Jerib's trick doesn't work as the Fiend promised, thought Malone, then it won't matter how many troops the Imperials have brought. Whether they kill us all or not, by the time Archon is done with us, we will wish they had.